Hey guys, tonight we're time travelling backwards into the dusty corners of your daily life. The ones that look totally modern on the surface, but still echo with the clanging bells and strange logic of the medieval world. And we're starting with a classic, the 9-to-5 work schedule. Yep, that soul-sucking stretch of hours you either dread or have just resigned yourself to. Spoiler, it's not some timeless truth of human productivity. It's basically the cursed love child of medieval monks, candlelight, and industrial-era guilt. And yeah, you probably won't survive this reality check.
Yep.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't want your pity likes. Also, drop your city and what time it is for you in the comments. I want to see if you're doom scrolling at 2 AM or pretending this is your wind down. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, picture this. You're in a cold stone monastery in 10th century France. Outside, it's either snowing or about to snow because medieval Europe. Inside, bells ring out through the corridors before the sun even considers rising. You wake not because of personal ambition or your Fitbit, but because it's time for matins, the first of 7 daily prayer services that mark the canonical hours. These monks weren't just spiritual overachievers, they basically laid the groundwork for the way you now experience time. Their strict schedule broke the day into distinct chunks: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Catchy, right? Each prayer time was spaced out across the daylight hours, and here's the kicker. This rigid structure of dividing the day into tasks and obligations didn't stay behind monastery walls. Over time, it bled into town life, merchant schedules, and eventually the labour laws that now haunt you. The medieval church was obsessed with order, spiritual and temporal. They needed the human soul and its daily routine to follow a predictable path, like the planets or the saints' feast days. Now fast forward several centuries to the Industrial Revolution. Factories need workers to show up at specific hours. What template do they use? The monk's schedule, but, minus the chanting and slightly more child labour. Throw in candle shortages and the inefficiency of working after sunset, and you've got a daily grind that more or less had to fit between breakfast and sundown. The bell that once summoned you to prayer, now it's a steam whistle pulling you into a smoke-choked factory. And here's where things get extra weird. Even though we now have electricity, Wi-Fi, and the ability to literally work from a beach in Bali, we still cling to this strange, inherited day structure like it's sacred. Why are you answering emails at 8:59 AM with one eye open and a coffee V-drip? Because 1,000 years ago, some sleep-deprived monk thought it was a good idea to break the day into chunks for God. You're welcome. Quirky side fact, medieval peasants might have actually had better work-life balance than you. Sure, their lives were short and full of plagues and probably lacked decent sandwiches, but they didn't clock in and out. Their days moved with the sun and the seasons. Winter meant rest. Sundays, off. Festivals, more time off. They worked in rhythms, intense planting and harvesting periods, followed by long stretches of downtime. You, meanwhile, get PTO, if your boss doesn't forget to approve it. Of course, this isn't without debate. Some historians argue the 9-to-5 is more a product of the 20th century, especially with the rise of labour unions and Henry Ford's factory model. Ford's big innovation was giving workers weekends off. Shocking, I know. But even he built on older patterns. Before Ford, labourers worked longer, but the framework of a start and stop schedule, that came from much earlier. The monks may not have invented time, but they sure did their best to put it in a chokehold. And let's not ignore the psychological hangover. You probably organise your day with this eerie medieval guilt attached, like productivity equals virtue. You wake up late on a Saturday and immediately feel like a sinner. Sound familiar? That's not capitalism talking. That's centuries of religious conditioning whispering, sloth is a deadly sin, you useless goblin. We internalise the idea that rest needs to be earned, not simply allowed. It's like you're living inside a monastery, but with Slack notifications. Of course, now there's pushback. Flex hours, remote work, 4-day work week experiments. But even those are framed as rebellious, like you're breaking sacred laws rather than just living reasonably. It's wild how hard it is to shake off habits baked in by candlelight and incense. So yeah, that calendar notification you got for a 9 AM Zoom call tomorrow, Blame a monk from 940 AD who couldn't sleep and decided everyone else should suffer with him. The rigid clock you punch, the guilt you feel for taking a nap, the weird obsession with productivity, all of it has a whisper of those echoing monastery bells behind it. Next time you find yourself staring at the microwave waiting for your sad lunch to finish heating, just remember, you're not stuck in a modern grind, you're just living out the long tale of medieval timekeeping. Alright, so now that you're fully aware your workday is a monk-imposed illusion, let's slip into something a little more romantic. Literally. Time to talk about that shiny little circle of metal some of you wear on your finger every day, without ever questioning why. You know, the wedding ring. Seems harmless, right? A symbol of love, commitment, undying devotion, the whole hallmark shebang. But here's a fun little twist. The tradition you're following comes wrapped in a strange stew of ancient anatomy myths, property laws, and a whole lot of superstition. Love is great, sure, but that ring? You're mostly just wearing a medieval lie on your hand. Let's rewind. Ancient Egyptians are often credited with kicking off the idea of ring exchanging, and they did have their own flair for romance. They believed the circle represented eternity, no beginning or end, just a cosmic loop of devotion. Cute. But fast forward a few centuries, and here come the Romans bringing their own kind of spice. They also gave rings to their betrothed, but not out of sentimental awe. Nope. Roman engagement rings were a legal marker, proof that a woman now belonged to a man's household, like a receipt. And yes, the ring finger tradition, that came from them too, based on the now debunked belief that a vein, vena amoris they called it, ran directly from the fourth finger of the left hand to the heart, which is sweet, until you realise it's completely false. Modern anatomy says nope, no special love vein on that finger, it's just regular plumbing down there. But hey, don't let facts ruin your romance. People clung to the story for centuries, because what's a better excuse to assign cosmic significance to jewellery than pseudoscience and cultural inertia? By the time we hit the medieval period, the wedding ring had morphed into something a bit more ceremonial. Christian Europe absorbed the Roman ring tradition and sprinkled in a holy vibe. Rings were blessed by priests, sometimes even during elaborate church ceremonies, making them not just symbols of union but tools of spiritual surveillance. The church was obsessed with codifying marriage. It wanted control over who got hitched, when and how. The ring became part of that control system. It wasn't just I love you, it was I own you and God's cool with it. Now here's a quirky little detour for you. Some medieval rings came with inscriptions on the inside, hidden love poems or religious warnings like God unite us or death parts us. Kind of romantic, kind of ominous. Others weren't romantic at all, they were posy rings, popular among the literate elite, engraved with short, rhyming phrases that range from cute to passive-aggressive. Imagine slipping on a ring that reads, "Think of me when you don't." Peak medieval shade. But even stranger was how rings operated as status symbols and legal tools. In certain medieval laws, a woman's acceptance of a ring could be seen as a binding contract. No need for a fancy ceremony or cake. If she took the ring, boom, she was married. Which led to all kinds of drama. People would later argue in court that a ring had been given in jest or without intent, leading to long, messy trials where someone's entire future depended on whether a gift of jewellery was serious or just a flirt. And speaking of flirtation, men didn't always wear rings. That trend didn't catch on widely until the 20th century. For most of history, the ring was something women wore. Again, more proof of ownership than a mutual promise. The idea of a man wearing a wedding ring would have been confusing, or even emasculating to a medieval noble. His commitment was assumed. Hers needed to be visible. Now, scholars argue about just how unbroken this ring tradition really is. Some believe there were long periods where rings weren't common at all, or that other symbols, like belts or even garlands, were used instead. Others point to regional differences. In some areas, betrothal rings were more common than wedding rings. In others, you'd only wear a ring if you were upper class. One thing's for sure, there's no clean line from ancient Egypt to your neighbourhood jeweller. The wedding ring tradition is a bumpy road full of weird detours, commercial add-ons, and a fair amount of theological pressure. And yet, here we are. Modern weddings still revolve around this tiny object. People spend thousands, even millions on these rings. We obsess over the metal, the stone, the cut, the clarity. All to fulfill a ritual that started as a weird blend of bad science, property transfer and superstition. Don't even get me started on diamonds. That's a whole other modern myth slapped on top of a medieval one. A late-stage capitalism garnish on your ring finger lasagna. So next time you look at your ring, or someone else's, just pause for a moment. Beneath all that sparkle is a long, tangled history of heartbeats and half-truths. You're not just wearing a promise, you're wearing 2,000 years of human confusion about love, law, and the vascular system. Now that your wedding ring is officially a tiny historical scam sitting on your finger, let's head to the dinner table. You know, that sacred arena where elbows off the table somehow matters more than your opinion on politics. Ever wonder where those fussy little etiquette rules came from? Why you're judged for licking your knife, or using the wrong fork like you just declared war on high society? Spoiler, it's not because of hygiene, it's not because of class. Well, okay, it is because of class, but not the kind that comes from a masterclass subscription. Nope, your table manners are leftovers from medieval power games, carefully designed to show off who had control, who had money, and, very importantly, who didn't. Let's drop you into a medieval feast. You're a guest at the long table of some baron's great hall. The room smells like smoke, roast meat, sweaty wool, and maybe a faint trace of something you hope isn't the dungeon. Torches flicker, a lute is being aggressively strummed, and in front of you is a thick slab of stale bread called a trencher. It's not a plate, it is the plate. Your food goes right on top of it, and by the end of the meal it's a soggy meat-soaked sponge. Yum. If you're lucky, a servant tosses it to the dogs. If you're less lucky, it's handed to a beggar. Leftovers, charity, and structural inequality, all wrapped into one squishy loaf. Now here's where the etiquette creep starts. Back then, eating was very public, very performative. You weren't just feeding yourself. You were showing people who you were. Whether you were noble, religious, or just really good at pretending, every bite was an audition. That's why rules began emerging, not for cleanliness, but for social dominance. Wiping your hands on the tablecloth? Barbaric. Using your knife to scoop food? Peasant behaviour. Speaking with your mouth full? Only if you wanted to die socially right there between the boar and the barley. And about those utensils, forks didn't even enter the European scene in any major way until the 11th century, and people were suspicious. Forks were seen as decadent, even sinful. Why? Because God gave you fingers. Using a tiny metal pitchfork to eat your figs was borderline heresy. One medieval church leader called them an insult to God, which feels dramatic even by today's influencer standards. The fork finally caught on around the Renaissance, but even then, it was a status symbol. Poor people still used their hands. Nobles used forks, sometimes gold ones, just to prove a point. Now, quirky fact time. In some royal courts, your social rank determined how many fingers you were allowed to use while eating. Yes, actual finger quotas. High-ranking nobles could use 3 fingers. Lower ranks, only 2. Imagine being demoted from 3-finger to 2-finger status because you offended someone's cousin at a feast. Your dignity, gone, along with your ability to grip a greasy chicken leg. By the high medieval period, manuals began popping up, early etiquette books, written by clergy or moralists who were deeply concerned that people might chew too loudly, or, heaven forbid, lick their knives. These books didn't care about bacteria. Germ theory was still several plagues away. No, they wanted people to act with restraint. Control at the table meant control in life. If you could eat like a saint, maybe you weren't a sinner, or at least not a loud one. This brings us to the modern dining table, where you probably sit with your family during the holidays, trying to remember which spoon is for soup while pretending you didn't just Google how to eat asparagus politely. Most of what you're doing, napkin on the lap, don't reach across the table, chew with your mouth closed, it all traces back to those medieval performance rituals. And while some of it makes sense now, nobody wants to hear your mashed potato monologue, a lot of it is just empty signalling. It doesn't make you cleaner, it just makes you look like you belong. Of course, historians debate just how rigid these old rules really were. Some say etiquette was mostly a noble obsession, while the lower classes had their own looser codes. Others argue that even peasants followed social rituals, just ones adapted to their context. A shepherd might not care about fork placement, but he'd still know when to offer the last hunk of bread to a guest. Etiquette in any form is about sending signals. I'm one of you. I know the rules. Please don't exile me. And we still do this today. We stress over dinner parties, clench our jaws when someone uses a butter knife like a sword, and shame kids into mastering please and thank you before they can spell their own names. We dress it up as manners, but deep down we're still medieval about it. Still trying to prove something, still playing status games, still performing dignity at the dinner table. So the next time you're at a restaurant, awkwardly navigating a place setting with 6 pieces of cutlery, like you're defusing a bomb, just remember, it's not about hygiene, it's not about civility, it's about showing you can play the game. A game written by nobles with wine-stained scrolls and an unhealthy fear of fingers. You're standing in your bathroom, door locked, fan on, the whole sacred ritual of modern privacy in full swing, and it probably doesn't feel strange. But if you plucked a random person from the medieval world and dropped them into your life right now, the idea of pooping in total isolation behind a locked door would be absolutely alien to them. Not because they didn't have toilets, well, kind of, but because privacy, especially in the bathroom, is a weirdly modern obsession. And yes, we're going there. Tonight we're talking about bathroom privacy panic, medieval latrine life, and why your quiet alone time on the porcelain throne might be the most historically confusing thing you do all day. Let's begin in the castle. Imagine you're a noble, walking the chilly corridors of your stone manor. When nature calls, you head to the garderobe, basically a little stone closet built into the castle wall, usually perched high above a moat or cesspit. There's a wooden bench with a hole, and when you're done, gravity takes care of the rest. Sometimes, if you're lucky, there's straw or moss to wipe with. The real fancy types, they might use bits of cloth, but here's the part you're not ready for. There are no doors, no locks. If someone walks by, oh well, you're just doing your business like everyone else, and you wouldn't even think twice about it. Because in the medieval world, privacy wasn't a given. It was barely a concept. People slept, ate, worked, and yes, defecated in full view of others. A family of 6 might live in a single room. Public bathhouses were communal, often gender mixed. In villages, outhouses or pits were shared. The idea of needing to be alone to use the bathroom would have been, at best, suspicious. At worst, a sign that you were doing something unholy. Now let's pivot to monasteries again, our old pals from the 9 to 5 section. Monks had communal latrines called reredauters. Picture a long stone bench with several holes side by side and no partitions. You'd sit elbow to elbow with your fellow monks, possibly making polite small talk or debating the finer points of scripture while, well, you get it. And no, this wasn't considered gross. In fact, it was practical, humble, and aligned with monastic values. No vanity, no excess, no individualism. The real bathroom revolution came not with the flush toilet, but with the rise of shame. As cities grew and societies got more rigid, particularly in the Victorian era, people started demanding more privacy. Bodily functions were increasingly seen as taboo, something to be hidden, managed, sanitized. You can thank centuries of religious purity culture, industrial era modesty, and a deep fear of being thought unclean. And once plumbing entered the scene, with pipes running through walls and water tanks overhead, it finally became possible to close the door and pretend none of it was happening at all. Quirky fact. In medieval times, people sometimes kept chamber pots under the dining table so they wouldn't have to leave during meals. Yep, that was a thing. You could excuse yourself discreetly, do your business within arm's reach of the roast chicken, and then continue the conversation. Today, if someone even mentions the bathroom at dinner, you physically recoil. Funny how the line of what's acceptable keeps moving. And while we're on the subject, did you know that in some medieval cities people just dumped waste into the streets? They'd yell "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "regardez-l'eau," or "watch out for the water," and chuck the contents of their chamber pots out the window. Not great for public health, but honestly, kind of efficient. You didn't need privacy. You needed good aim. But here's where scholars love to argue. Some insist that medieval people did crave a sense of modesty, pointing to the way toilets were sometimes tucked away from public spaces, or how certain texts describe the use of screens or curtains. Others counter that these examples are exceptions, not the rule. For the most part, bathroom privacy just wasn't a thing. You were expected to deal with your bodily functions the way you dealt with the weather, openly, occasionally with frustration, and definitely not in secret. So why do we cling to bathroom privacy so fiercely today? Partly it's plumbing. Modern sanitation allows us to isolate the act completely, sound, smell, everything. Partly it's culture. We've spent centuries wrapping the body in layers of control, turning normal functions into private rituals, and partly it's psychological. The bathroom is one of the few places you can be alone without being questioned. It's your fortress of solitude, your scroll-through TikTok sanctuary, your escape room without the puzzles. But the next time you lock that door and sigh with relief, just remember, you're doing something that most of human history would find bizarre. They wouldn't just wonder why you need privacy. They'd wonder what you're hiding. And honestly, considering how many of us use that time to just sit and disassociate for 10 minutes, they might have a point. You've built a shrine to privacy where once there was only a bench, a breeze, and a line of monks with digestive issues. And somehow, that feels like progress. And also, a little bit like denial. Alright, let's take a hard left from bathroom etiquette into something equally weird and widely misunderstood. Chivalry. Yeah, the knight in shining armour stuff. Holding open doors, laying jackets over puddles, dying for honour, all that jazz. Somewhere along the line, chivalry became shorthand for treating women nicely, or maybe just being polite if you have a sword. But let me gently peel that polished illusion off for you. Chivalry wasn't about kindness or romance or being a gentleman. It was about power. It was about control. And most of all, it was a brilliant medieval PR stunt that somehow stuck around long enough to ruin every modern first date. So let's set the scene. You're in 12th century France. Knights are the celebrity athletes of the day. Famous, violent, and frequently unemployed between wars. Think high testosterone, low impulse control, and a desperate need for something to do with all their time and weaponry. The church, looking around at all this chaos, decides to tame the beasts. They start building the idea of chivalry, a code of conduct for knights that'll keep them from murdering each other, and peasants, just for fun. And what's in this code? Well, it's kind of a mess. Parts of it tell knights to defend the weak, be loyal, and serve God. But others are full of contradictions. Kill in the name of honour, avenge insults with blood, fight tournaments that are basically medieval WWE. The idea was to civilise violence, not to end it. Knights were still expected to fight. They were just supposed to fight for the right reasons. Here's where the whole respect women thing starts sneaking in. Enter courtly love. A literary invention, not a real social movement. This was a set of romantic ideals cooked up by troubadours and poets. According to them, the perfect knight devotes himself entirely to a noble lady, usually married, usually out of reach. He writes her poems, he suffers in silence, he performs great deeds in her honour, even though they'll never be together. Sounds noble? Maybe, but remember, this was fantasy. A knight could behead a man in battle at noon and still write a sonnet to Lady Clotilde by dinner. But in practice, honouring women didn't mean what you think it means. It wasn't about equality or consent. Chivalry saw women as prizes, symbols, or moral props. A knight might vow to protect a lady, but only in the same way he might protect his sword or his horse. Women were precious because they were delicate, beautiful, and useful for reputation, not because they were people with agency. The entire system was built on paternalism and possession. Want a weird example? Take the pas d'armes, a chivalric stunt where a knight would block a road or a bridge and refuse to let anyone pass unless they first fought him, or declared their devotion to a lady. Can you imagine trying to get to work and having some chainmail-wearing dude yell, "Declare your loyalty to Lady Winifred or prepare to duel"? That's not romantic. It's a traffic problem with delusions of grandeur, and the contradictions just keep piling up. Knights were supposed to defend the church, but they routinely pillaged monasteries. They were supposed to protect the weak, but also joined crusades to slaughter thousands in the name of faith. They were expected to be courteous, but courtiers were notorious for sexual coercion disguised as flirtation. One minute you're writing a love ballad, the next you're abducting someone's daughter. That's not chivalry, it's gaslighting in plate armour. Modern culture picked up the filtered version of chivalry. By the time Victorian moralists got their hands on it, the brutal parts were scrubbed clean, and what remained was a fragile blueprint for how real men should behave. Open doors, pay for dinner, defend her honour, whatever that means. But it's all theatre. No one talks about how medieval chivalry also demanded blood vengeance, and the occasional jousting accident that left someone's cousin decapitated. Those bits don't play well in rom-coms. Now here's a fringe fact to chew on. Some scholars believe the whole chivalric code was less about morals and more about making the knightly class look useful. By the late Middle Ages, kings were consolidating power, standing armies were rising, and knights were becoming, well, obsolete. Creating a moral code gave them a new image. Not just thugs with swords, but spiritual warriors, defenders of justice, agents of courtly ideals. It was reputation management before LinkedIn. Of course, there's still debate. Some historians argue that chivalry, for all its flaws, helped curb violence in medieval society, that it created a shared value system, however inconsistent, that offered a rough kind of stability. Others say that's nonsense, that it was mostly lip service, used to justify the same brutality under a shinier label. Either way, the end result is the same. A code born in blood, dressed up in poetry, and quietly lurking in your modern dating expectations. So next time someone sighs and says, chivalry is dead, maybe remind them, it was never alive in the way they think. It was just an image, polished and repackaged over centuries, designed to tame violence and romanticize control. If anything, the real chivalric move would be admitting that kindness doesn't need armor, and respect doesn't need a code, it just needs effort. Also, maybe skip the sonnet. So far, we've dragged your workday, your jewelry, your dining habits, your bathroom rituals, and your ideas about romance through the medieval muck. Now let's talk about something a little more personal, your relationship status. Or more specifically, why being single still carries that faint stink of suspicion. Like, why does every nosy aunt, HR form, and tax code seem to need to know why you're not married yet? Why is bachelor still a loaded word? Well, buckle up, because this awkward social tension didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was hard-coded into medieval law. That's right, the bachelor tax. Not a meme, a very real policy. And even though no one's fining you for being single anymore, yet, the attitude behind it is still alive and silently judging your solo Friday nights. Let's rewind to late medieval Europe, where marriage wasn't just a romantic choice, it was a social obligation. Society needed you to pair up and start cranking out babies like your life depended on it. Because guess what? It kinda did. More bodies meant more workers, more soldiers, more taxpayers, and more people to replace the ones lost to plagues, wars, or, that one cow that kicks real hard. So if you reached adulthood and weren't married, people got nervous. What was your problem? Were you unfit, disloyal, maybe even unnatural? This anxiety turned into law. Multiple times throughout medieval and early modern Europe, local governments imposed bachelor taxes, literal fines or penalties on unmarried men. Why men? Because they were expected to lead households, own property, and produce heirs. Single women got the shame treatment too, of course, but the legal and financial punishment hit the bachelors hardest. Some towns in Italy and Germany levied annual taxes on single men after a certain age. In other places, bachelors couldn't hold certain public offices or were denied voting rights in town councils. You weren't just missing out on cake and awkward toasts, you were politically sidelined for your failure to wed. And it gets better. In 1695, England introduced the Marriage Duty Act, which was a fancy name for a tax scheme targeting the unmarried and childless. It was supposed to fund war efforts and encourage population growth, but it quickly devolved into a bureaucratic headache. Officials had to go door to door figuring out who was married, who had kids, and who was just dodging both. Imagine some powdered wig guy knocking on your door to ask why you haven't locked down a spouse yet. Romance. Now, the quirky detail here, some of these laws weren't even enforced all that well. Like a lot of medieval policies, they were more symbolic than practical, tools to publicly shame the unmarried, even if the actual tax collection was spotty. But symbols matter. The message was clear. Marriage equals civic duty. Singleness equals social threat. Fast forward to today, and while no one's sending you a tax bill for being single, unless you're filing jointly with your cat, the vibe still lingers. Think about how many laws and benefits are structured around marriage: health insurance, immigration, inheritance, tax breaks. Married people often get bonuses, while single people quietly pay full price for existing. And socially, we still treat marriage as a finish line. Every rom-com ends at the altar, not the therapy session 10 years later. Entire industries are built around fixing singleness. Apps, coaches, retreats, reality shows. Being alone isn't seen as a valid choice. It's seen as a problem to be solved. And let's not forget the language. Words like spinster and bachelor are loaded with judgment. This single man might be seen as independent or mysterious, but push past 30 and suddenly he's immature or commitment phobic. A single woman. She's either empowered or unlovable, depending on who's talking. These narratives didn't pop out of the modern dating pool. They're echoes, deep distorted echoes, of medieval anxieties about order, productivity and lineage. But here's where scholars like to argue. Was the bachelor tax really about moral panic, or was it just economic desperation dressed up in virtue? Some argue it was a purely fiscal move. Cities and states needed cash, and unmarried men were low-hanging fruit. Others say it was about control, plain and simple, forcing citizens into stable, predictable family units that could be taxed, watched and weaponized if needed. The truth, as always, is probably both. And don't let the history books fool you into thinking everyone bought into it. There were always outliers, people who chose singleness on purpose. Some were religious figures who took vows of celibacy, others were artisans or scholars who just didn't want the baggage. And some, let's be honest, probably just liked their own space and didn't want to share a bed with someone who bathed once a month. Still, the pressure was immense. Marriage wasn't just a milestone, it was a duty. And that medieval blueprint still shapes how we treat single people today. We don't fine them anymore, but we subtly punish them in 100 tiny ways. The restaurant table for one, the +1 wedding invite that comes with guilt, the raised eyebrow from your great-aunt when you say you're just enjoying life. So the next time someone asks, when are you going to settle down? You can smile sweetly and say, I'm just resisting medieval population policy. That ought to shut them up, or confuse them. Either way, you win. Let's take this walk of medieval absurdity one step further, right into your local Sunday laws. Ever tried buying wine before noon on a Sunday? Or noticed that certain businesses just don't open on that day, no matter how desperately you need new socks or emergency waffles? Yeah, you can thank medieval Europe for that charming little inconvenience. These relics are known as blue laws, and they still quietly dictate chunks of your weekend, even if no one actually remembers why they exist. Spoiler, it's not about rest, it's about guilt. Medieval, church-infused, daylight saving time before it was cool guilt. To understand how we got stuck with no alcohol before brunch o'clock rules, you have to go way back to when the church ran the show. Think post-Roman Empire Europe, where the one institution that didn't completely collapse was the Catholic Church. In that vacuum of power, they stepped up, not just spiritually but politically. If you were a king, your legitimacy came from the church. If you were a peasant, your suffering was justified by the church. And if you thought about working on a Sunday, well, the church made sure you regretted it. Sunday was declared the Lord's Day, dies Dominica, and you were expected to rest, worship and reflect. Not do laundry, not fix your roof, not pop down to the market. Early on, this was more of a religious vibe check than actual law, but by the time Charlemagne came along in the 8th century, things escalated. He passed legislation mandating rest on Sundays. Violators, fined, punished, or publicly shamed. And you better believe the church leaned in hard. Work on Sunday? That's not just disrespectful, that's practically sinning with your hands. And the idea stuck. Through medieval Europe, laws popped up banning everything from fieldwork to baking on Sundays. Some regions even prohibited travel, music or bathing. Yes, bathing, because clearly cleanliness was morally suspicious. The rationale was always the same. You weren't just breaking civil law, you were insulting God. The 7th day was his, period, and you were supposed to sit down, shut up, and contemplate eternity, or at least look like you were. Fast forward a few hundred years to Protestant Reformation times, and things get spicy. While reformers ditched some Catholic practices, they doubled down on Sunday laws, especially the Puritans. These guys turned rest into an Olympic sport. In Puritan New England, you could be fined for playing games on Sunday, fined for going for a stroll, fined for being too cheerful, possibly. These folks were all in on the idea that joy was suspicious and God was watching, constantly, like the world's most judgmental neighborhood watch. And here's the twist. Many of these medieval and Puritan rules were absorbed into colonial American law, then into US state legislation. That's where the term blue laws comes in, possibly named after the blue paper they were printed on, though historians are still arguing about that. The point is, these laws hung around. States started banning alcohol sales on Sundays, closing businesses and prohibiting entertainment like theatre, sports or dancing, all because of a 1,500-year-old guilt trip. Let's sprinkle in a quirky side note here. In some US towns as late as the 1800s, you could be arrested for mowing your lawn on a Sunday, or for travelling more than a certain distance. In one case, a man was arrested for catching a fish on Sunday. A fish in water on his day off. Civilization. Today, a lot of these laws are fading or ignored entirely, but some still linger like old coffee stains. In certain states, car dealerships can't open on Sundays. Liquor stores operate on limited hours. Even sports schedules used to revolve around Sunday restrictions. Early NFL games were partially scheduled around the assumption that fans would be coming from church. And let's not forget how many businesses just don't open on Sundays, especially in small towns. It's not a coincidence. It's institutional hangover. Of course, there's debate. Always is. Some historians argue that these laws were about protecting workers and ensuring rest in a brutal, labour-heavy world. That they were proto-labour laws, if you squint hard enough. Others argue that's revisionist fluff. Sunday laws weren't about compassion. They were about obedience. Work when we say, rest when we say. And if you break the rule, shame, sin, possibly fish-based legal trouble. And yet somehow, we still kind of follow them. Not always by force, but by habit. Sundays feel sacred, even if you're not religious. There's a stillness to them, a weird guilt if you try to get too much done. Like some tiny medieval priest is sitting on your shoulder whispering, "Do laundry on Monday, you heathen." Even the modern idea of Sunday scaries, that creeping dread before the work week starts, has a tinge of old spiritual angst. The day of rest was never truly restful. It was about preparation, reflection, fear of judgment. Sound familiar? No. So next time you're standing outside a liquor store at 10:58 a.m. on a Sunday wondering why it's locked tighter than a nun's diary, just remember, you're not late. You're early. For a system designed in the 800s to keep you holy, quiet, and possibly bored. So far you've been caught in the medieval trap of work schedules, marriage expectations, dinner table power plays, and Sunday guilt. But tonight, let's shine a flickering torch on something more personal, your hands, specifically your left one. Ever notice how left-handed people still get the short end of, well, everything? Scissors, desks, spiral notebooks. The side of the table that guarantees elbow war at dinner is not a coincidence. It's not ergonomics. It's medieval fear, plain and simple. Because once upon a very judgmental time, being left-handed wasn't quirky. It was cursed. Let's start with the basics. Language has always had beef with the left. The Latin word for left is sinistra. Yep, same root as sinister. In contrast, right comes from dexter, which evolved into words like dexterity. So from the jump, we've been coding left as bad, wrong, and evil, while right gets to be pure, skillful, and, well, correct. You don't need a PhD in linguistics to see where this is going. In the medieval period, this linguistic bias hardened into social suspicion. People genuinely believed left-handedness was a sign of something darker, demonic influence, bad luck, or moral corruption. In some religious art, Satan is shown tempting from the left side. On Judgment Day, the blessed go to God's right, the damned to his left. If you were a kid using your left hand to write or eat, chances are someone, a parent, a priest, a teacher with an unsettling smile, would forcefully correct you. Because obviously, the devil was in your wrist. And here's where it gets absurd. In certain medieval courtrooms, oaths had to be sworn with the right hand. Left hand? Not legally binding. Some professions outright barred left-handed people. Sword training, made for righties. Farming tools, right-handed. Musical instruments, right-handed. Being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient, it was incompatible with the way the world was literally built. Of course, it didn't stop there. In Christian ritual, the sign of the cross had to be made with the right hand. Touch your forehead with the left, and you might as well be summoning a demon. In Islamic cultures too, the left hand was considered unclean, used for less sacred tasks. In medieval Europe, this belief combined with church doctrine and folk superstition to form a kind of moral panic around left-handedness. It wasn't a variation, it was a threat. Here's a quirky nugget. In medieval fencing manuals, there are rare but fascinating sections that address how to fight a left-handed opponent. These passages treat lefties like they're unicorns with knives, dangerous, unpredictable, unnatural. The solution? Train extra hard to deal with their cursed trickery, which honestly sounds like a compliment disguised as an insult. Now, there's an ongoing debate among scholars about how widespread or serious this left-hand bias really was. Some argue that it was mostly symbolic, an abstract moral thing that didn't affect day-to-day life unless you were caught drawing pentagrams with your left pinky. Others insist the bias had very real consequences, especially for children in religious schooling, where left-handedness was aggressively corrected, often with punishment. And let's not pretend this all faded with the plague. It clung on. In fact, you can draw a straight, an infuriating line from medieval superstition to modern classrooms in the 19th and even 20th centuries. Kids were still having their left hands tied behind their backs, rulers smacked across their knuckles, all in the name of discipline and proper form. Left-handedness was treated like a behaviour problem, not a trait. Imagine being punished for breathing through your nose wrong. That's the level of logic we're dealing with here. Even in the legal system, this medieval ghost lingers. The phrase left-handed compliment still means an insult disguised as praise. 2 left feet implies clumsiness. Out in left field? Crazy. No one ever says you're their left-hand man, and despite centuries of supposedly enlightened thinking, left-handed tools and spaces are still an afterthought. Ever tried opening a can with the wrong kind of can opener? That's not just annoying, it's the industrial age's way of telling you you're cursed. But here's the kicker. Statistically, left-handed people are overrepresented in high IQ brackets, creative professions, and sports. And no, that's not just confirmation bias from the few smug lefties who survived the notebook spiral gauntlet. Studies show that left-handedness often comes with lateral thinking, adaptability, and, ironically, a greater ability to handle chaos, probably because the world constantly throws chaos at them. And yet the suspicion endures. Try handing someone something with your left hand in certain cultures and watch the subtle recoil. Ask a grandparent why you shouldn't favour your left hand, and you might get an awkward pause followed by some outdated nonsense about discipline. The medieval stink is still there, just hiding under a layer of hand sanitizer. But maybe the strangest part of all this? We still treat being right as inherently better. Not just with hands, but with choices. Right side of history. Right kind of people. Right way to think. Maybe it's all rooted in that ancient belief that the world should be ordered, clean, predictable. No room for left turns. No patience for unpredictability. So if you're a lefty, or you know one, congrats. You're carrying around a piece of history that people once feared, punished, and tried to scrub out of existence. All because you use the hand that everyone from medieval monks to Victorian teachers thought belonged to demons. And honestly, that kind of sounds like a superpower. You've made it this far with your left hand proudly defying centuries of superstition, so let's talk about something even more fundamental. Measurement. Specifically, how you know how long a foot is, or an inch, or a yard. You probably assume, in our super scientific, space-exploring, AI-arguing modern world, that our system of measurement is based on logic, precision, mathematics, right? Oh no, that foot you're using? It was someone's actual foot, and not even a scientifically agreed upon foot, just a royal one. Yes, the body of a long-dead king is secretly haunting your ruler, your tape measure, and probably your construction estimates. And honestly, it shows. Let's unravel it. Long before standardized units, people measured stuff using what they had on hand, which very literally meant their hands. A hand was the width of your 4 fingers. A span was the distance from your thumb to your pinky when you stretched them out. A cubit was the length of your forearm. And yes, a foot was the length of, well, a foot. That works great when you're measuring your own table, but less great when you're building a castle and realise your buddy Jeff's forearms are longer than yours by half a chicken. In comes the monarchy, wielding not just swords and divine right, but also personal body parts as universal metrics. The most infamous case? King Henry I of England, who ruled in the early 12th century and supposedly declared that the standard yard would be the distance from the tip of his nose to the end of his outstretched thumb. I repeat, your modern yardstick exists because of some guy's arm span, the royal nose to thumb. Elegant. Of course, there's a lot of scholarly debate around this. Some argue that this was more symbolic than literal, a kind of branding move. Let it be known that Henry's body equals the truth. Others say no, it really was that chaotic. Kings were living measuring tapes. Their bodies became law. And remember, this was an era where few people could read, so physical demonstration trumped charts and diagrams. The king was the standard, morally, politically, and yes, spatially. Now, medieval systems of measurement weren't just inconsistent, they were aggressively local. One town's foot might be 11 inches. The next town over, 13. This wasn't just annoying, it was a nightmare for trade. Imagine trying to buy a bolt of cloth in one village, only to discover that your yard is 2 inches short in the next. Cue arguments, fistfights, and the rise of the official measurer, a medieval job that involved carrying around a rod certified by the king to settle measurement disputes. That's right, people used to walk into town with a government-issued stick to keep everyone honest, and if you think the foot is wild, wait until you meet the acre. In medieval England, an acre was defined as the amount of land a team of oxen could plough in one day. Not a standard area, just whatever the oxen managed before they needed a nap. So every acre was slightly different depending on terrain, weather, and the general mood of the oxen. And we still use this unit today. It's right there on real estate listings. 2 acres of land, translation. Enough space for 2 very motivated oxen on a good day. Even the inch has its medieval quirks. One early definition, 3 grains of barley laid end to end. That's not a joke. Barley grains, the very stuff you brew beer with. If the grains were too dry or too fat, too bad, that inch was going to fluctuate harder than crypto. It wasn't until much later, during the rise of centralized nation-states and scientific thinking, that people started screaming, "Can we please just agree on how long a foot is?" But even then, resistance was fierce. Units were tied to identity, local pride, even religious belief. The metric system, developed during the French Revolution, was pitched as a logical alternative. Units based on nature, not nostrils. But outside of science and most of Europe, metric struggled. Americans famously clung to their feet, their inches, their acres, like they were holding off an invading army of decimals. So here we are, centuries later, still using a body-based measuring system that was literally stitched together from royal limbs and barley math. Construction blueprints, sewing kits, and interior design plans. These are all haunted by medieval improvisation. And when your IKEA shelf says, "Measure twice, cut once," remember, one of those measurements might trace all the way back to a king's foot. A foot possibly encased in chainmail. Or gout. Now, quirky fringe fact. The fathom, used mostly in nautical terms, is about 6 feet. Originally the average distance between a man's outstretched arms. Sailors used it to measure depth by throwing ropes overboard with knots tied every fathom. So the entire maritime industry was out there dunking rope and trusting someone's average arm span not to get the boat stuck on a reef. It's amazing we ever crossed an ocean. So what does this mean for you, with your rulers and your tape measures and your measure twice mindset? It means you're carrying the weight of a system born not of precision, but of medieval guesswork and royal anatomy. Every time you measure a doorway or map out a floor plan, you're participating in a deeply weird historical hangover. You live in a world where standardized is still, at its roots, deeply personal, and kinda arbitrary. So next time your bookshelf is off by half an inch, and you're cursing the instructions, just remember, that's not bad carpentry. That's medieval math coming for you from beyond the grave. After that royal body part detour through medieval measurements, let's wander into another part of your daily life that seems perfectly modern on the surface, but smells faintly of incense and chalkboards, your education. Specifically, the entire structure of your schooling system. Grades, lectures, exams, caps and gowns, the weirdly competitive spelling bees. Yeah, all of it. It might look like the product of rational progress, Enlightenment values, or some post-industrial revolution miracle of bureaucracy, but surprise. The modern classroom still carries the DNA of medieval church schools, monastery libraries, and a very specific obsession with Latin that somehow never fully died. So picture yourself waking up in the year 1250. You're not heading to school as you know it, not unless you're a boy, from the right family, and preferably not a peasant. But if you tick those boxes, congrats. You're being sent to the local cathedral school or monastery. These places were the academic powerhouses of medieval Europe. They existed to train clergy, not teach multiplication tables. The church needed priests who could read scripture, copy texts, and ideally, not completely bungle Latin. So schooling back then, it was about salvation first, employability second, and absolutely zero concern for your learning style. This is where the structure begins. Students sat in rows. A master, or magister if you're fancy, stood at the front reading aloud from texts. Most students didn't have their own books, because books were hand-copied, chained to desks, and cost more than a small house. Instead, students memorized, recited. copied from slates, over and over. You sat there, repeating phrases in Latin, passing grammar like your soul depended on it. Because in a way it did. And exams, oh, they existed. Usually oral, terrifying and held in public. You might be quizzed on logic, theology or grammar in front of your peers and masters. No pressure. Fail badly enough, and you could be mocked, demoted, or denied advancement. Sound familiar? It's the same performance anxiety that makes people sweat through standardized tests today, just with more robes and slightly fewer scantrons. But here's the twist. The medieval university system wasn't just about parroting theology. By the 12th century, a kind of academic explosion happened. Places like the University of Bologna, Paris and Oxford became hubs of scholarship, not just religious but philosophical, medical, legal. And their structure. They invented a lot of the bones of modern education. Degrees, bachelor, master, doctorate, departments, lectures, graduation ceremonies, even dormitories. So yes, when you throw your cap in the air at graduation, you're mimicking a tradition that started when people still thought leeches could cure headaches. And while we're here, let's talk about those black robes and square caps. They weren't designed for drama. Robes were simply what scholars wore back in the day. Long, sober garments that said, "I spend my time reading, not jousting." The square academic cap or mortarboard probably evolved from the biretta, a clerical hat worn by Catholic clergy. So again, your graduation photos, basically cosplay from a 13th century monastery. Say cheese. Quirky fact time. Medieval students were not passive little choir boys. They formed guilds, held protests, and even rioted. At the University of Paris in the 13th century, students once walked out en masse over rent prices. In Oxford, a student riot once ended with a few people dead and the entire university being temporarily shut down. So yes, student drama predates Twitter. The difference? Back then, it might literally involve torches and pitchforks. But of course, not everyone got to play. The medieval education system was brutally exclusive. Girls, largely out. Poor kids, out. Anyone who didn't speak Latin, good luck. That exclusivity echoed forward into centuries of gatekeeping in education, some of which still exist today. Legacy admissions, tuition barriers, standardized testing bias, all of it can be traced back to medieval roots where knowledge was hoarded, controlled, and handed out selectively to those deemed worthy by the powers that be. Now, scholars debate how direct this educational lineage really is. Some argue the Enlightenment drastically overhauled medieval learning, that science and rationalism pushed religion out of the classroom. Others argue we just slapped new paint on an old chapel. Sure, you're learning about mitochondria now, not original sin, but the framework, still suspiciously medieval. Sit down, be quiet, memorize, repeat. Grades as judgment, teachers as gatekeepers, progress measured by testing, not understanding. Even the idea of school calendars being tied to summer breaks. That has medieval agricultural roots. Students, especially in rural areas, were expected to help with planting and harvest. That's why school let out in summer, not for your vacation but for your manual labour. And yet, even in modern cities with zero cows, we still cling to the same school rhythm, as if the wheat demands it. And spelling bees? You think those are just about literacy? Think again. Medieval scholars competed in public displays of memorization and Latin fluency, complete with prizes, status and audience. Today's spelling bees are just slicker, brighter, and full of kids whose brains are basically microchips. But the principle remains knowledge as performance, correctness as virtue, and a deep, centuries-old fear of getting something wrong in front of a crowd. So next time you walk through a high school hallway, or try to help a kid with math homework while silently Googling how to divide fractions, just know you're still dancing to the tune of a monk with a quill. The bells, the lectures, the desks in rows, the exams, the hierarchy of degrees, it's all been polished, upgraded and Wi-Fi enabled. But the skeleton, pure medieval. You didn't choose the scholastic life. The scholastic life chose you, in Latin, with homework. So far you've survived royal measuring sticks, monk-made school systems, and some pretty judgy attitudes about being left-handed. But now we're diving into something you've probably done without even questioning it. A little ritual that feels totally harmless, maybe even sacred. It's Friday, you're at a diner, the waiter says the fish special is on, and you pause before ordering your usual burger because, wait, isn't it no meat on Fridays? Even if you're not religious, there's a weird little pulse in the culture that says fish equals holy. Why? Because of Jesus? Sort of. But also because of church politics, economic manipulation, and a centuries-long tradition that turns out to be, frankly, pretty fishy. Let's cast this net way back. Early medieval Europe. Christianity was spreading like wildfire, and as it did, church leaders needed ways to help people feel connected to their faith in a daily visible way. Enter fasting. Not just for Lent, but for regular recurring reminders that your body should be denied pleasure, if only temporarily, for the sake of your eternal soul. And Fridays? Those became special. That was the day Jesus was crucified, according to Christian tradition, so fasting on Fridays became a weekly act of penance. But here's the twist. Fasting didn't necessarily mean eating nothing. It meant abstaining from certain kinds of foods, especially meat. Because meat was tied to feasts, to wealth, to indulgence. It was hot, heavy, and sinful. Fish, on the other hand, cold, wet, boring, spiritually safe. Now, the quirky part. Medieval fasting rules weren't just about cutting back. They were extremely specific. You could eat fish, but not beaver tail, because it was too fatty and was, confusingly, sometimes classified as meat. Also, beavers lived in water, and in one legendary medieval loophole monks argued that meant they could be treated like fish. This led to long, semi-serious theological debates about what counted as meat. Puffins? Debatable. Whale blubber? Possibly. Barnacle geese, mythical birds believed to grow out of driftwood, were, for a time, declared fish by some very creative bishops. The logic? If it comes from water, it counts. Like the fish stick rule, but medieval. And here's where it really gets layered. The church didn't just push fish for spiritual reasons. They were also entwined with economic interests. Monasteries often owned fisheries. Fishmongers were tied to powerful guilds. Coastal cities benefited from the demand. The more people abstained from meat, the more the fish trade boomed. So, yes, your humble tuna melt has roots in a medieval synergy between faith and finance. Imagine the church as both your spiritual advisor and your seafood supplier. By the time the late Middle Ages rolled around, Fish Fridays were baked into the calendar. In Catholic Europe it was standard. No meat on Fridays, and during Lent, even more intense restrictions. Entire cookbooks were devoted to fasting meals, full of elaborate fish dishes for the wealthy and sad, dried fish scraps for the poor. The concept of suffering through Lent became a kind of culinary performance. See how holy you can be while still secretly enjoying a very fancy smoked eel tart. But it wasn't all guilt and penance. Some people found joy in the challenge, creating ingenious recipes to work around the restrictions. Almond milk was a common meatless substitute. Rice pudding with spices became a delicacy. Medieval cooks knew how to game the system, turning fasting into a loophole-ridden buffet of technically not meat miracles. Even today you can see the remnants of that creativity in certain dishes, like fish pie or mock meats that trace their origins back to monastic kitchens trying to keep it holy without going hungry. Of course, when the Protestant Reformation came swinging through the stained glass windows of Europe, all this fishy business got a second look. Reformers, especially in places like England and parts of Germany, pushed back hard against Catholic food laws. They saw them as empty rituals, unbiblical rules, or in some cases outright scams. In England under Edward VI, meat-eating on Fridays was practically a political statement. But then, just to keep things confusing, Queen Mary flipped everything back, and the cycle continued. Fish became a religious football, passed back and forth between competing theologies. Even in later centuries the influence endured. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you still see Catholic communities observing no meat on Fridays, especially during Lent. In fact, in some countries, it was the law. In Ireland, for example, meat on a Friday used to be so taboo that even butchers would close shop that day. Restaurants would remove meat from menus, and in the US, the tradition quietly shaped corporate behaviour, most notably with one very greasy example, the McDonald's Filet-O-Fish. Yes, the Filet-O-Fish was invented in the 1960s by a franchise owner in Cincinnati to cater to Catholic customers who weren't buying burgers on Fridays. It was a solution born of religious tradition and declining sales, and it worked. So even in your fast food drive-thru, the ghost of medieval fish fasting swims on, batter-dipped and laid gently on a steamed bun. Now, is all this still necessary? Depends on who you ask. Scholars debate whether the church's dietary rules were sincere efforts to promote discipline and humility, or just another way to control people through their stomachs. Some argue it helped create a shared cultural rhythm. Others say it was a classic case of pray with one hand, profit with the other. Either way, the practice has left a mark. Even if you don't observe it, you probably know someone who does. Or maybe you've felt a weird pang of guilt biting into a chicken sandwich on a Friday in March, even if you have no idea why. That's not divine judgment. That's 1,000 years of cultural programming gently nipping at your appetite. So the next time you pick the fish option, ask yourself, are you doing it for your cholesterol? Or are you just still obeying a rule made by monks in robes, arguing over whether a sea otter counts as dinner or sin? So far we've seen how fish sandwiches, royal feet and classroom rituals all owe their existence to medieval oddities. But let's not stop at your lunch tray. Let's talk about your entire sense of social mobility. Or maybe lack thereof. You've probably heard the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? Well, that casual little jab at nepotism is actually the long wheezing echo of a medieval truth. The idea that your birth, your bloodline, your family name could, and still does, quietly dictate your career path. In other words, welcome to the not-so-dead legacy of medieval bloodlines and job lines. Let's rewind to the feudal era. Picture yourself born into a small village in 13th century France. If your father is a blacksmith, congrats. Guess what you're doing for the rest of your life? That's right. You're grabbing the hammer, not because it's your passion, not because of a 5-year career plan, but because feudal society ran on inherited roles. Occupations were passed down like family heirlooms. The tools, the skills, the clientele, it all stayed in the family, and stepping outside that structure was nearly impossible. This wasn't just cultural habit, it was economic structure. Medieval society was organised into estates, or orders. At the top, you had the nobility and clergy. They ruled and prayed. Below them, everyone else worked. If you were a serf or a villain, your job wasn't just to till the land, it was to stay in your lane, for life. Upward mobility wasn't a dream, it was heresy, or at least suspicious enough to make people think you were either a con artist or a witch. Now, the quirky thing is that this rigid system didn't only apply to peasants. Even within the noble classes, birth determined function. If you were born the second son of a noble house, you were often shipped off to the church, not because of a calling, but because the firstborn got the land and title, and you got the tonsure. So even among the rich, job assignments followed bloodlines like GPS signals. It wasn't what you were good at, it was what your last name and birth order told you to be. Guilds made sure of this too. These were the powerful labour organisations that governed trades in medieval towns. Want to be a shoemaker, a goldsmith, or a candlemaker? You had to join the guild. And to join the guild, well, your best bet was being born into it. Sons of guild members got priority, while outsiders faced endless obstacles. Apprenticeship rules were strict, expensive, and lengthy, sometimes lasting a decade or more. And even after that, becoming a master required resources, recommendations, and connections. Basically, it was the medieval LinkedIn, and if your dad wasn't already in the network, good luck. Of course, there were exceptions. People who managed to claw their way into different classes or professions. Some peasants became wealthy through trade. Some bastard sons of nobles found fame through military service. But these were outliers, and the system worked overtime to keep them rare. Social climbing was not celebrated. It was policed. Fast forward to now and the language has changed, but the structure, still suspiciously familiar. We talk about networking, legacy admissions, family businesses, nepotism babies. You don't need a coat of arms anymore, just a dad with the right contacts. Whether it's politics, Hollywood, or your local real estate office, the pattern remains. Birth and connection often override merit. Sound familiar? Scholars still argue about how much of this we've truly outgrown. On paper, we have meritocracy. Anyone can go to college, apply for a job, start a company. But in practice, generational wealth, social capital, and unspoken gatekeeping shape opportunities just like medieval birthrights did. You might not be a blacksmith because your father was, but if your parents were doctors, chances are you're swimming in a pool of soft advantages, private schools, tutoring, unpaid internships, and that warm smile from someone who recognises your last name. And surnames? They weren't just for fun back then. Many of the surnames we carry today are occupational relics from that system. Smith, Baker, Taylor, Cooper, Chandler, all of them literally branded you with your job. You didn't just have a role, You were that role. John Smith wasn't just a guy. He was the guy who made stuff out of metal. Your name, your identity, and your labour were a single unit. We've separated those ideas now, at least on the surface, but dig a little and you'll see the residue. It's still there. Your last name might not get you a job interview, but it might shape how people perceive your background, your fit, your imagined worth. And here's the fringe fact of the day. In some medieval communities, it was considered scandalous for someone to not follow in their father's footsteps. A butcher's son becoming a carpenter? That raised eyebrows. People saw it as disloyal, even dangerous. Communities were tight, and trust was built around predictability. If you broke the chain, you weren't just challenging the economy, you were threatening the very idea of order. So when you're updating your resume, fretting over your college major, or explaining to your uncle why you quit the family business to become a yoga instructor/UX designer, just remember, you're doing something your ancestors probably couldn't. You're breaking a chain they weren't even allowed to question. And yet, even with all that freedom, you still feel the pressure. Still hear the whispers. Still wonder if you're meant to do something just because of who raised you. Because in the end, the line between medieval feudalism and modern capitalism is thinner than you think. It's not just about blood anymore, it's about legacy, access, and who's already sitting at the table. And while the seats may be less covered in velvet, the guest list, still incredibly familiar. So now that you know your career might still be haunted by your great-great-great-granddad's job, let's turn to something that feels even more personal, and more frustrating if you've ever lost a spelling bee because you forgot whether weird follows the I before E rule. That's right, we're cracking open the bizarre, tangled, utterly medieval mess that is English spelling. Because if you've ever wondered why the GH in enough sounds like an F, or why colonel is pronounced like colonel, the answer isn't logic or linguistic evolution. It's centuries of chaos involving monks, invaders, printing presses, and one or two guys who just made stuff up and dared us to question it. Let's rewind to early medieval England, before English was even English. The island was a linguistic patchwork. Latin from the Romans, Old Norse from the Vikings, Old English from the Anglo-Saxons, and eventually a hearty dose of French after William the Conqueror stomped ashore in 1066. What this meant, functionally, was that spelling wasn't standard because the language wasn't standard. People wrote words the way they sounded to them, using whatever alphabet soup was floating in their heads. If 5 monks copied the same sentence, you might end up with 5 different versions of the word sheep, or church, or anything, really. And for a long time that didn't matter. Spelling wasn't about correctness, it was about communicating sound. Language was flexible, messy, alive. You could write through as through, throw, or throw, depending on your region, your education, or whether your candle was running low. The thorn letter, tiast, the yog, or jwul, and other now extinct characters were all fair game. The idea of a wrong spelling? That was basically non-existent. Then came the Normans. French-speaking rulers brought not just a new ruling class, but a tsunami of French vocabulary and spelling conventions that steamrolled Old English like it owed them money. Suddenly, cow coexisted with beef from boeuf, house with mansion, maison, and so on. English vocabulary doubled almost overnight, but without any plan for how to spell any of it. The result? A Frankenstein language with the DNA of several invaders and absolutely no consistency. So when you look at English and wonder why cough, bow, and though all end the same but sound different, well, welcome to post-Norman England. But the real disaster came with the printing press. When William Caxton brought printing to England in the 1470s, he had a problem. There were still no standardised spellings, so he and his printers just picked whatever versions they liked, or whatever fit neatly into the line without needing to reset the type. That's right. Part of English spelling is shaped by the physical size of metal letters. Some words were padded with silent letters to make the text line up neatly. Debt, for example, used to be spelled det. The B was shoved in later to make it look more Latin, because obviously nothing says clarity like random silent consonants added for aesthetics. And let's not forget the great vowel shift. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the pronunciation of English vowels changed dramatically. Long I went from sounding like E to I. E became E. A went all over the place, and U began to sound like ow or oo, depending on its mood that day. This happened after many spellings had already been printed and set, meaning the pronunciation changed, but the spelling stayed fossilized. That's why bite doesn't rhyme with bit, and why night looks like someone fell asleep on their keyboard. Quirky fact. Some people have tried to fix this. In the 16th century, a guy named Sir Thomas Smith proposed a new phonetic alphabet with more logical spellings. Later, even Benjamin Franklin gave it a shot with his own reform system. But guess what? No one wants to relearn how to spell everything just to make sense. People cling to the spellings they know, even if they don't make sense, because it feels like tradition. Like how we all agree that Colonel should sound nothing like it looks and just move on with our lives. Scholars love to debate whether English spelling is a historic tragedy or a quirky treasure. Some argue that our chaotic spelling preserves the rich history of English, every silent letter, a little fossil from an earlier form. Others argue that it's a cruel, inefficient system that punishes kids, dyslexic readers, and anyone learning English as a second language. And they're not wrong. It takes English-speaking children significantly longer to learn to read fluently compared to kids in languages with more consistent phonetic spelling, like Spanish or Finnish. Yet, here we are, still spelling night with a K, still teaching children that I before E except after C is a rule. It isn't. And still clinging to the idea that mastering spelling is somehow a moral achievement. Entire competitions are built around this, because nothing says intellectual superiority like correctly writing appoggiatura under pressure. But here's where it all loops back to the medieval roots. The obsession with spelling, with written language being correct, started not with linguists or educators, but with clerics. Medieval scribes weren't just copying texts, they were preserving doctrine. Spelling errors could change the meaning of scripture, or at least be seen as signs of sloppiness, even sin. Over time, the idea of correct spelling became tied not to clarity but to morality. If you spelled things wrong, maybe you thought wrong, maybe you were wrong, and that ghost still lingers. Even today, a spelling mistake in a resume or email can sink your credibility. Never mind your ideas, if you typed there instead of there, you're suddenly a half-wit in the eyes of whoever's reading. It's a purity test. And guess who designed the first ones? Monks with pens, poor lighting, and a deep belief that the devil lived in lazy grammar. So the next time you're wrestling with a silent K or second-guessing conscience versus conscious, remember, you're not the problem. The problem is a 1,000-year-old system built by invaders, poets, monks, and printers who each spoke differently, spelled freely, and never imagined we'd be trying to standardize their chaos in group chats and job applications. You're not bad at spelling. English is just really, really bad at being consistent. Alright, so now that we've wrestled our way through the linguistic junk drawer that is English spelling, let's shift gears and talk about something so routine, so embedded in your daily life, you probably don't even question it. Picture this. Someone sneezes. You, instinctively, maybe even involuntarily say, "Bless you." They nod in appreciation, and the moment moves on like nothing happened. But wait. Why do we do this? What does a sneeze have to do with blessings? Is someone being attacked by demons? Is the soul briefly exiting the body? Did we all sign some ancient social contract during flu season and forget? Strap in, because this sneezy little ritual has deep, strange, and slightly plague-scented medieval roots, and of course absolutely no reason to still be a thing. Let's start with the oldest explanation, the one that's been passed down like a grimy family heirloom. The idea that sneezing expels your soul from your body, or creates a moment of vulnerability when evil spirits can slip in. That belief predates the Middle Ages, sure, but it really hit its stride during medieval times, when people were deeply committed to the idea that invisible forces were constantly trying to hijack your body. You sneeze, that's your soul making a break for it. Or maybe a demon's moving in. Either way, someone needs to yell "bless you" to cover the situation. A spiritual force field in 2 words or less. But the most famous origin story is tied to the Black Death. In the 14th century, the plague came sweeping through Europe like a death-scented hurricane, killing millions. One of the earliest signs of infection, sneezing, often followed by painful swellings, buboes, in the armpits and groin. People were terrified. Medical knowledge was a toxic stew of astrology, bad smells, and don't anger God. So most treatments boiled down to prayer, panic, and herbs that smelled slightly less awful than death itself. During the worst outbreaks, Pope Gregory I reportedly encouraged people to say, "God bless you," whenever someone sneezed. The idea was that a quick prayer might ward off the plague, or at least buy you enough time to make peace with your maker. Whether that decree actually came from the Pope or just filtered down through terrified rumour is up for debate, but the effect stuck. Saying bless you became an act of hope, a tiny spell, a reflex against the apocalypse. And while the plague eventually calmed down, a few hundred years and tens of millions of deaths later, the habit didn't. Bless you became baked into social etiquette. By the 16th century, it was considered rude not to say it. You sneeze, people bless you. You don't say thank you. Now you're the jerk. A complete reversal. Once a life-saving invocation, now a politeness reflex. We do it automatically, even though no one in the room actually thinks your soul is halfway to purgatory. Here's a quirky side fact. Not every culture goes with the blessing angle. In German, people say Gesundheit, which just means health. Practical, straightforward. You sneeze, they wish you well. In Icelandic, the phrase translates to may you live, which honestly feels both supportive and slightly threatening. But in medieval England, saying nothing after a sneeze could be interpreted as cold, rude, or even suspicious. Like maybe you were the one bringing on the bad spirits. Of course, scholars debate whether this ritual is truly medieval, or just a medieval remix of older pagan and Roman customs. Ancient Romans were also weird about sneezing. They saw it as a sign of divine favour. In fact, saying bless you or good health during sneezing goes back thousands of years across cultures. What the Middle Ages did was turbocharge it with extra fear, religious overtones, and just enough plague trauma to hardwire it into Western etiquette. And we're still not done with the weirdness. At various points in the medieval period, sneezing was thought to be a sign of all kinds of things: divine revelation, suppressed emotion, or even magical influence. People wrote treatises about it. They interpreted the direction of your sneeze like weather omens. Sneeze in the morning, good luck. Sneeze at night, might die. Sneeze while someone's talking about you, confirmation that they're a liar. Honestly, it was a full-body prophecy system that happened to double as immune response. Even today, there are lingering fragments of that superstition. Think about how sneezing is still treated as a moment that demands public acknowledgement. If someone sneezes multiple times and no one blesses them, things get tense. People will actually apologise if they sneeze and no one says anything. That's how deep this reflex goes. You're expected to verbally participate in another person's bodily function. Why? Because medieval people were terrified that the devil could ride in on a sneeze and park in your sinuses like it's a timeshare. And then there's the triple sneeze panic. 1 sneeze? Bless you. 2 sneezes? People start looking around nervously. 3? Someone starts asking if you're okay, and someone else starts casually backing out of the room. No one's saying it's the plague, but also no one isn't saying it. That anxiety, that micro-reaction, a subtle inheritance from centuries of associating sneezing with illness, danger, and spiritual vulnerability. And it's not just limited to sneezes. Yawning, hiccups, even sudden shivers used to get their own superstitious treatments. But sneezing won the cultural lottery. It got a permanent seat at the etiquette table because it combined all the right ingredients: visible drama, uncontrollable timing, a sound loud enough to interrupt a sermon, and just enough mystery to invite divine commentary. So next time someone sneezes and you hear a chorus of bless yous, just know you're participating in a 1,000-year-old mass coping mechanism. A cultural ghost of pandemics past, spiritual panic, and medieval medicine that thought a sneeze was basically a warning shot from God. You're not just being polite, you're casting an ancient spell with your mouth, and if you forget to say it, well, good luck explaining to your ancestors why you let a demon slip through the nasal gates unchecked. If you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered why our entire culture seems locked in a never-ending war with its own face, welcome to the hauntingly persistent beauty standards that trace their roots straight back to the medieval world. Let's talk about something very specific and very telling: the obsession with fair skin. Not just pale, but glowing, untanned, veiny, almost porcelain white skin, the kind that screams, "I have never worked a day in the sun." Today it's hiding in your foundation bottle, your Instagram filters, and half your skincare regimen. But the origin? Oh, it's medieval as heck, and as ridiculous as you'd expect. Back in the Middle Ages, your skin tone wasn't just a personal detail, it was a billboard for your social status. Pale skin meant one thing: you didn't labour outside, you weren't a field hand, you didn't milk cows or harvest turnips or, God forbid, sweat. You were a lady, or a nobleman, or a young monk with more time than sunlight. Fairness equaled wealth, and wealth equaled cleanliness, refinement, and divine favour. So naturally people went to extreme lengths to bleach their faces into ghostly perfection. And I do mean extreme. Medieval skin whitening techniques range from the mildly ill-advised, covering your face in lead-based powder, to the outright horrifying, bleaching your skin with vinegar and chalk or applying mercury compounds. The goal was always the same: erase any trace of tan, flush or earthiness from your complexion. Because if you looked too alive, too pink, too brown, too warm, you might be mistaken for a servant or worse, a peasant. It wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a form of social camouflage. Beauty was status, and pale beauty, that was elite. Medieval women would shade themselves under wide hoods, avoid sunlight like it was sinful, and even trace fake blue veins on their forearms and temples to give the illusion of paper-thin, noble skin. If you're wondering whether this obsession was healthy, no. No, it was not. But it was widespread, and it stuck. Here's a particularly quirky gem. In some texts from the late Middle Ages, women were advised to apply a paste made of crushed pearls mixed with honey and egg whites to purify the skin. Crushed pearls. As if the road to radiance ran through your jewellery box and your breakfast. Bonus points if you also kept a diet light on red wine and spices, because apparently anything that increased circulation or colour was a one-way ticket to looking vulgar. If your cheeks had colour, you were accused of vanity. If they were flushed naturally, you were suspiciously close to sin. Now, was everyone actually walking around looking like albino porcelain dolls? Not exactly. Plenty of people had tans, sun-darkened skin, and zero access to powdered lead. But the ideal, what people aspired to, what poets praised, what paintings immortalised, was the pale, delicate woman who looked one faint breeze away from a Victorian fainting couch, even though, to be fair, those hadn't been invented yet. And that ideal survived. It just got updated. Fast forward a few centuries and the Renaissance picks up where the medieval world left off. Only now the pale beauty standard gets repackaged with classical references and a touch more artifice. Fair skin becomes not just a class marker but a canvas. Powdered faces, rouged lips, painted brows. But the underlying message remained. The lighter your skin, the higher your status. The further you were from labour, the more refined you appeared. And the legacy didn't stop with Europe. Colonialism took this toxic standard global. When Europeans colonised vast swaths of the planet, they exported not just gunpowder and disease, but their aesthetic preferences. Fairness became the default beauty ideal in places where dark skin had previously been normal, even celebrated. Entire industries sprang up around skin whitening, industries that still exist and thrive today. Bleaching creams, fair and lovely products, and whitening filters on photo apps. They're not new, they're just medieval rot in a modern bottle. Of course, not all medieval cultures shared the same standard. Some regions celebrated olive skin, golden tones, or even robust, healthy complexions that reflected vitality. But the dominant Western ideal, the one that stuck and spread and ended up dictating how movie stars are lit and how foundation is sold in drugstores, was born from that old belief that beauty means lightness, and lightness means superiority. Now, scholars debate how much of this was driven by the church, class structure, or pure aesthetic preference. Some argue that fair skin symbolised moral purity, white as virtue, darkness as sin. Others point to economic roots. If you weren't working outside, you were elite, and the beauty standard simply mirrored that reality. Still others say it's a complex combo of both, with race, gender and religion all tangled up in a centuries-long feedback loop of who gets to be called beautiful. And we haven't escaped it. Even today, marketing, media and pop culture continue to push pale, filtered, airbrushed imagery as the default. Skin tones get lightened in photo shoots. Foundation ranges stop short of actual inclusivity. And tanning, when it does make a comeback, has to be perfectly bronzed. Not too dark, just sun-kissed, like you summered in Tuscany instead of doing manual labour. But here's the thing. The standard isn't real. It's not fixed. It's not truth. It's an echo. A weird, dusty medieval leftover that crawled into our modern lives through paintings, poems, powder pots, and centuries of conditioning. Fairness is not a virtue. It's not moral. It's not superior. It's just one flavour of beauty that got a 1,000-year head start. So the next time you feel tempted to apologise for your skin tone, buy a brightening serum. or hide from the sun out of more than just SPF concern, pause. Ask yourself, am I doing this because I want to, or because some long-dead courtier with face powder and a rosary convinced the world that beauty means looking like you've never seen a shovel? Now that we've untangled the ghost of pearl paste complexions and medieval beauty paranoia, let's dive into something even more controlling, your sense of time. And not in a poetic, time is a construct kind of way, but in the very literal TikTok way. Why your day is broken into 24 hours, why clocks rule your schedule, why you stress about being 5 minutes late to a meeting, even if no one else has arrived, and most importantly, why time feels like a thing you serve, not a thing that serves you. Spoiler alert, it all started with bells, monks again, and a calendar built around the apocalypse. So picture this. It's the 8th century, and you're a monk in a chilly stone monastery somewhere in northern Europe. You wake not because you're well rested, but because a giant bell clangs in your ear at some ungodly pre-dawn hour. It's time for matins, the first of 7 daily prayers known as the Divine Office. These are spaced out through the day and night. Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext, Nun, Vespers, Compline. Like the world's most exhausting spiritual playlist set on loop. The bell rings, you pray. The bell rings again, you work. The bell rings again, you eat, then pray, then sleep. And then it starts all over. This system didn't just organise monks, it quietly reprogrammed everyone else. Monasteries were the centres of community life, and over time, their schedule became the schedule. Monastic bells began to structure village routines. You worked when the monks worked. You rested when the monks rested. Their prayers, meant to keep the soul on track, ended up syncing the entire community like a very slow, very judgmental iCal. Now here's where it gets more interesting, and slightly terrifying. The medieval concept of time wasn't just about hours, it was tied to salvation. Every moment of the day was steeped in divine purpose. Miss a prayer? You're out of sync with God's plan. Eat at the wrong time. That's not just rude, it's spiritually sloppy. This wasn't time is money, this was time is morality, and to keep yourself morally aligned, you needed to know when it was the right hour. Enter mechanical clocks. They start showing up in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, not as personal timepieces but as massive public monuments, tower clocks with one job, to ring the bells. These early clocks didn't have faces or hands. You didn't read time, you heard it. Every hour was announced with sound, like a giant churchy Alexa yelling, "It's 6 o'clock, go to Compline or be damned." And people listened, not because they were anxious about missing brunch, but because the apocalypse was always on their minds. And no, that's not just dramatic framing. Medieval Europeans lived in constant low-grade fear of the end of the world. Calendars were built around holy days, doomsday prophecies, and saints' feasts. The world could end any day, any hour. So measuring time wasn't just about productivity, it was about spiritual readiness. Being aware of the time meant being aware of eternity. Now here's a fun fringe fact. Before mechanical clocks, time was often measured using canonical hours, sundials, water clocks, and even candle clocks. Yes, they burned candles with marks on the side to track time. One monk reportedly burned 12 candles each night, each carefully calibrated to burn for an hour. That's commitment. Also, kind of a fire hazard. But once mechanical clocks took over, everything changed. Suddenly time was everywhere, and standardized. You couldn't just say, "I'll be there around sunset." Now you had to be there at the 8th bell, or you risked missing work, mass, confession, or market. Time started to become something you owed, and not just to God, to your boss, your community, your betters. This laid the foundation for the modern obsession with punctuality. By the Industrial Revolution, time wasn't just tracked, it was monetized. Factory whistles replaced monastery bells, but the logic stayed the same. You follow the clock or you get punished. Show up late, lose a day's wages. Take too long on your lunch break, get docked. The old divine order had been replaced by capitalist scheduling, but the effect was the same. Time ruled, and you obeyed. And here we are, centuries later, with digital clocks on every wall, screen and wrist, still bowing to the bell. School bells, shift start times, workout classes that run in 45-minute chunks. We've sliced our lives into clean segments, not because it's efficient, but because monks once decided God liked it that way. Now, scholars still debate the full impact of medieval timekeeping on modern life. Some argue that mechanical clocks liberated humanity, allowing for progress, coordination, and a shared reality. Others insist they enslaved us, chaining human life to an artificial rhythm that disconnects us from natural cycles. You wake to an alarm, not the sun. You eat lunch at noon, not when you're hungry. You race against a deadline set by a machine, not your own pace. And sure, there are rebels. The slow-living movement, flexible work schedules, the occasional blessed nap that happens completely outside of time. But even then, you're still operating within the framework. You're choosing to ignore the clock, which means the clock still wins. So next time you check your phone for the time, then check your watch because you didn't trust your phone, and then glance at the microwave clock just to be sure. Pause and think. You're carrying 1,000 years of monastic scheduling in your back pocket. That little number in the corner of your screen. That's not just time. That's a medieval bell still ringing. And the worst part, you're probably already late for something. Since we're already under the oppressive thumb of time, let's take a look at where that clock is usually dragging you. Your job, or your internship, or your unpaid opportunity that suspiciously feels like a full-time position with no actual compensation. Ever felt like your job was just an endless ladder of proving yourself to people who barely notice? Yeah, that's not burnout talking. That's feudalism with a LinkedIn account. Because as modern as your career might seem, with its project management apps, awkward Zoom meetings and team-building exercises involving trust falls and catered tacos, it's still running on some very old DNA, and I'm talking medieval feudalism old. Let's set the stage. Imagine you're a serf. You live on a noble's estate. You don't own your land. You rent it, kind of. You grow crops, maintain the grounds, and owe a portion of your labour and harvest to your lord. In return, he gives you protection, whatever that means, and doesn't kick you off the land. It's not slavery, technically, but you can't leave without permission, and upward mobility is basically fantasy. There's no climbing the ladder because there is no ladder. There's just your spot in the mud and the boots standing on your back. Now fast forward to today, and you're not growing turnips anymore, but you're still stuck doing grunt work for someone higher up the food chain. You're told to pay your dues, start at the bottom, prove your loyalty. Sound familiar? That's not just work culture, that's feudal logic dressed in business casual. And internships? They're the serfdom of the modern era. You offer your labour, your time, your youth, and in return you get experience, maybe a letter of recommendation, and the vague hope that someday you might be allowed to do real work for actual money. This structure didn't come out of nowhere. It grew from centuries of apprenticeship models, themselves rooted in the feudal system. In medieval towns, if you wanted to become a blacksmith, a tailor, a stonemason, you didn't just apply. You entered into an apprenticeship. You worked under a master for years, often living with them, doing chores, observing, and gradually being trusted with actual tasks. You didn't get paid, except maybe room and board, but in return, you gained a skill, and eventually maybe you'd become a journeyman, and one day, if you survived long enough, a master. But even that upward mobility was rigged. Masters controlled who got in, who moved up, and who got left behind. Guilds protected their own. If your family wasn't already in the trade, good luck. Apprenticeship was sold as a meritocracy but operated like a closed club. Just like internships today, advertised as open doors, often functioning more like velvet ropes. Here's your quirky fact for the day. In some medieval guilds, apprentices weren't just working for skills. They were contractually bound for years, sometimes starting as young as 7. They could be punished for laziness, fined for mistakes, and legally forbidden to leave. And if they broke the rules, the master could take them to court. You think your boss is strict because he micromanages your calendar? Imagine being sued by your mentor because you overslept. And then there's the language. Career ladder. Climbing the ranks. Working your way up. It's all a rebranded version of feudal hierarchy. You start as a nobody, a peasant in the office ecosystem, and if you work hard, say yes to everything, and don't get trampled, maybe you'll move up. But there's always someone above you. A manager, a senior manager, a director, a VP, a C-suite paladin who probably hasn't written an email in years. And the higher you go, the fewer the positions. Sound familiar? That's because in feudalism there was one lord, and a whole lot of serfs. Of course, some historians argue that modern labour structures are fundamentally different. We have rights now. Labour laws. Paid time off, if you're lucky. Unions, when they're not being quietly dismantled. But others argue the core logic hasn't changed. your time and labour still belong to someone else, and your ability to climb often depends more on who you know than what you do. And let's not forget the unpaid overtime, the emotional labour, the pressure to go above and beyond, which really just means doing more for the same pay while smiling like it's a reward. And remote work, it should be liberation. But even then, there are digital equivalents of the manor house. You log in on time, reply instantly to Slack messages, and perform productivity in 100 tiny ways just so someone else, someone higher, feels like you're earning your keep. And if you're an intern or entry-level employee, forget it. You're expected to absorb wisdom, suffer quietly, and be grateful for the opportunity. Gratitude has become the new obedience. It's no coincidence that people are burning out in droves. You were never meant to work like this. Not 40+ hours a week, not chained to performance metrics, not measuring your self-worth in quarterly reviews. That's not a modern invention, it's just serfdom with espresso machines and ping-pong tables. So the next time someone tells you to start at the bottom, or calls unpaid labour a rite of passage, or insists that this is just how it works, remember, that system was designed in a world of castles and bloodlines. You're not failing to thrive. You're being asked to thrive in a structure built to keep people exactly where they started. And while you don't owe fealty to a baron, and your boss probably doesn't own your soul, probably, you're still working under rules written centuries ago. Rules that say loyalty is currency, hierarchy is destiny, and breaking out of your role is rebellion. So take your lunch break, use your vacation days, demand pay for your work. And if you're still fetching coffee for someone who doesn't know your name, maybe it's time to burn down the digital manor. If you've ever gotten a weird look over your haircut, like maybe it was too shaggy, too short, too rebellious, or too bowl-shaped, you might think that judgment is all modern, tied to fashion, or maybe just someone's personal taste. But no. Once again, the medieval world has crept its way into your scalp because hair, especially in the Middle Ages, was never just hair. It was a symbol, a code, a flashing sign about who you were, where you stood, and whether or not you were going to heaven. Today's bad hair day is nothing compared to the judgment, ritual, and low-key surveillance attached to your head in the year 1250. Let's start with monks, because of course we are. You've seen it. The tonsure, that bizarre haircut where the top of the head is shaved bald, leaving a halo-like ring of hair around the edges. It looks like someone put a bowl on your head, forgot the middle, and called it a style. But this wasn't about fashion. It was about humility, sacrifice, and obedience. The tonsure marked you as God's servant. By shaving the crown, you symbolically removed worldly vanity. Bonus, it also made you easily identifiable in public. So if you were misbehaving in town, people knew exactly which monastery you were embarrassing. There were even different types of tonsure. The Roman style, aka the bald spot classic, the Celtic style, more of a forehead shave, and the Eastern style, shaved entirely. Each style had theological weight, and regional tension flared over which one was correct. This wasn't just hair, it was a turf war in follicle form. At one point, church officials held actual councils to settle arguments about hair shape. Yes, people gathered in candlelit halls to vote on how bald a monk should be. Now shift to knights and nobles. Their hair was a performance piece. Long flowing locks symbolised power, status, and in some cases spiritual favour. A knight's hair might be kept shoulder length and brushed to a glossy sheen, because looking good on horseback mattered. Helmet hair was a real problem. Beards, another layer of complexity. A clean-shaven face could signal youth or church affiliation, while a thick manicured beard might project wisdom, masculinity, or a fashionable affinity with King Arthur. But too much beard, you might look like a heretic, or worse, a peasant. And speaking of peasants, don't think they escaped the scissors of social control. Village women often wore their hair in simple braids or covered it with wimples, kerchiefs, or modest veils. Married women were expected to keep their hair hidden. To show it off was seen as flirtatious, if not downright sinful. A woman walking around with her hair uncovered was making a statement. Whether it was, "I'm single, I'm rebellious," or "I don't care if the priest clutches his pearls," it sent a signal. Unmarried girls, on the other hand, could wear their hair loose, especially at festivals, weddings, or religious processions. Loose hair was a symbol of virginity and youth, but also a kind of wildness. In art, saints and martyrs were often shown with their hair unbound to suggest purity and vulnerability. Witches, by contrast, were also painted with wild, unruly hair, But in their case, it meant temptation and danger. Same hair, completely different vibe. Hair was always saying something. You just had to know how to read it. Here's a particularly quirky medieval twist. If a woman was accused of adultery, she might be publicly shamed by having her hair chopped off in front of the village. It was seen as both punishment and purification. No need for a trial when your hair could do the talking. And if you were a man entering a monastic order or being punished for a crime, same thing, off with the hair. In medieval minds, cutting hair meant cutting ties to pride, vanity or sin, and people absolutely weaponized that symbolism. Now, scholars still argue just how strictly these codes were enforced. Some say hair customs were more about social expectations than actual enforcement. No one was roaming the fields measuring ponytails. Others point to historical records full of laws and punishments related to hair, especially in religious communities or noble courts. Either way, it's clear that hair wasn't just hanging out on your head. It was a political and moral statement, whether you liked it or not. And it didn't stop in Europe. Across medieval cultures, hair was charged with meaning. In the Byzantine Empire, male officials could be banished for growing their hair too long. In medieval Japan, samurai were known for their top knots, while cutting it off symbolized disgrace or retirement. In early Islamic societies, grooming rituals, beard length, hair cleanliness, were tied to both religious observance and public identity. Around the world, your haircut wasn't just personal, it was a public document printed on your skull. Fast forward to today, and you'll notice the echoes. We still treat hair as a kind of shorthand. Clean cut, responsible, buzzed, military, dyed pink, rebellious, dreadlocks. Depending on who's judging, spiritual, political or unprofessional, in job interviews, school dress codes and even courtroom appearances, people are still being evaluated, quietly or openly, based on how they've chosen to wear their hair. And when you challenge those norms, you don't just raise eyebrows, you raise alarms. Even in pop culture, hair is still symbolic currency. A character gets a dramatic haircut after a breakup. It means transformation. A villain has slicked back hair, obviously evil. A female lead takes off her wig in a moment of vulnerability. It's supposed to show raw authenticity. We don't have medieval tonsures anymore, but the instinct to assign meaning to hairstyles, still very much alive and clipping. So the next time someone says, "It's just hair," take a breath and smile. Because it never was. Not in the Middle Ages, not now. Whether it's a buzz cut, a braid, or a bleach blonde bob, you're not just styling. You're broadcasting. And every strand carries more history than you probably bargained for. Now that we've untangled the symbolism tangled in your hair, let's talk about something even murkier. Vibes. You know the feeling. You walk into a room and instantly sense something's off. Or maybe you meet someone and for no logical reason your gut says nope. You say things like, "That place has bad energy," or "She gives me weird vibes," and no one questions it. But here's the thing. You're not just being intuitive. You're quietly participating in a legacy of magical thinking that stretches all the way back to medieval witch tests and the strange belief that evil can be felt. Let's rewind to the Middle Ages, when everyone's favourite explanation for bad crops, disease or general misfortune was witchcraft. Didn't rain for 3 weeks? Witch. Cow gave birth to a lizard? Witch. Neighbour gave you side-eye at the market and now your bread won't rise. Burn her. And while many of these accusations were based on fear, prejudice, and good old-fashioned neighbourly spite, there was one strange common thread, the belief that evil left traces. It didn't just happen, it lingered. It warped the air, twisted the light, made you feel uneasy even if you couldn't explain why. In short, the vibes were bad. Medieval people didn't have our vocabulary for energy, but they absolutely believed in invisible forces. The devil, demons, corrupted souls, even enchanted objects, all were thought to emit a kind of spiritual static. If someone walked into a church and made the candles flicker, or if milk curdled after they passed by, that was evidence of something. Of course, they couldn't test for EMFs or read chakras, but they did have their own methods of vibe checking. Enter the witch test. These weren't subtle. You've probably heard of the classics. The ducking stool, tie someone to a chair and dunk them in water to see if they float, because floating meant rejecting baptism, obviously. The prick test, poke them with needles to find the devil's mark, or trial by fire, make them hold a hot iron and see if God heals the burn quickly enough. These tests weren't based on evidence, they were based on feelings. The community sensed that something was off. If you made people uneasy, that was grounds enough for suspicion. One especially bizarre test involved weighing suspected witches against a stack of Bibles. Too light? Witch. Because clearly, spiritual guilt makes you float. There were even villages with official witch prickers, whose job was to literally poke people until they found an insensitive spot on the body, which was considered proof of demonic influence. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds less like a test and more like a state-sponsored assault, you'd be correct. Now, quirky fringe fact, not all witch detection was so physical. In some places, a known witch was believed to emit mala aura, bad air. People avoided touching their clothing or drinking from their cups. They might refuse to make eye contact, fearing the evil eye. If a baby cried when held by a certain person, that person might be accused. It wasn't logic, it was mood. Medieval vibe culture was alive and suspicious. And the best part? None of it had to be consistent. You could be too quiet, witch, too loud, witch, too clean, definitely a witch, too messy, suspiciously earthy. A woman who lived alone, witch. A woman who lived with too many cats, super witch. It was an atmosphere game. You didn't need to be caught doing anything wrong. You just needed to make people feel weird. Fast forward a few centuries and the witch craze cooled down, after some absolutely catastrophic trials and more than a few judicial regrets. But the vibe-based suspicion didn't vanish. It simply evolved. Now we talk about toxic energy, negative people, or bad auras. We light sage. We avoid certain buildings. We call people energy vampires. On paper, it's all rational adult behaviour. But scratch the surface, and it's basically a softer, scented version of medieval witch hunting logic. Of course, today we're much more careful. We're not tying people to chairs and tossing them in ponds, at least not publicly. But we do ghost people who feel wrong. We avoid co-workers who give us strange vibes. We choose apartments, restaurants, and even romantic partners based on their unspoken energy. And sure, sometimes it's self-preservation, but sometimes it's just fancy superstition with a modern haircut. Scholars still debate how much of medieval witch panic was about belief versus politics. Some say it was a convenient excuse to remove inconvenient people, especially women, the poor, or the socially awkward. Others insist that many people genuinely believed in dark energy, in the same way we now believe in gut feelings. After all, human brains are pattern-seeking machines. If something makes us uncomfortable, we invent reasons. Sometimes those reasons wear robes and carry Bibles. Sometimes they wear yoga pants and talk about Mercury being in retrograde. And yes, there's plenty of evidence that we do perceive emotional cues from our environment. Psychology backs it up. Our brains are constantly scanning faces, posture, tone of voice, all in milliseconds. But once you add centuries of superstition to that hardwiring, you get a very specific kind of intuition that feels ancient and powerful, even when it's just your brain screaming danger because someone didn't smile back. So the next time you get the sense that someone is off, or that a place feels haunted, even though there's zero evidence, just know you're participating in a ritual much older than you. Your ancestors called it witchcraft. You call it a vibe. But deep down, you're both saying the same thing. Something here is wrong, and I can't prove it. So let's poke it with a metaphorical stick until I feel safe again. Just maybe skip the ducking stool this time. You're standing in a courtroom. Maybe you've been summoned for jury duty, or maybe you're just watching the latest high-profile trial unfold on TV. Either way, the scene is familiar. Solemn judges in black robes, lawyers throwing around Latin like they're summoning a demon, and in some cases, hello, United Kingdom, a full-grown adult in a powdered white wig pretending that doesn't look completely unhinged. Ever wonder why we do all this? Why courtrooms still feel like cosplay for a secret society? Well, buckle up, because this legal theatre is less about modern justice and more about medieval costume parties that refuse to end. Let's start with the robes. Judges wear long black ones, lawyers sometimes too, and the whole vibe is very sorcerer, but make it administrative. This isn't just for drama, though it certainly helps. The tradition of legal robes dates back to the 13th century, when English judges were expected to be clergy or at least cleric adjacent. At the time, law was deeply intertwined with religion. Justice wasn't just civic, it was spiritual. You weren't simply breaking the king's law, you were offending God's moral order. and nothing says piety like dressing like you're late for evening prayer. Originally, the robes weren't black. Judges wore robes of many colours depending on the season, the monarch, or how fancy they were feeling that day. Scarlet for big occasions, green or violet for others. It wasn't until the late 17th century, after the death of Charles II in 1685, that black robes became standard, allegedly as mourning attire that just stuck. It's like your friend who wears all black after a breakup and never goes back. And then there's the wigs. Oh, the wigs. In Britain and some of its former colonies, judges and barristers still don horsehair monstrosities on their heads in court. Why? Because in the late 1600s, wigs were the height of fashion among the aristocracy. Everyone wanted to look like Louis XIV, which meant towering curled hairpieces that said, "I have money and never do manual labour." Lawyers, eager to project authority, adopted the style. And when wig fashion fell out of favour among the general public, the legal profession just kept going, like a time capsule strapped to their scalps. You'd think they'd have moved on by now, but nope. To this day, courts in England and Wales still use wigs in certain trials. The stated reason? To preserve the dignity and anonymity of the court. But let's be honest, it's mostly tradition. An elaborate, slightly itchy commitment to looking like you walked out of a Restoration-era dinner party. Now, the quirky twist here is that different countries handled this differently. In France, after the Revolution, they stripped their legal system of aristocratic trappings. Robes were simplified, wigs were out, even legal language was purged of excess Latin. The goal was to democratize justice, strip away the theatrical nonsense and get down to business. Meanwhile, in England and its legal descendants, we clung to the performance like it was oxygen, because deep down, justice is theatre, and theatre needs costumes. And let's not ignore the Latin, habeas corpus, pro bono, amicus curiae. You don't need to speak Latin to get a law degree, but it helps if you want to sound like your argument is descending from the heavens on a scroll. Why Latin? Because medieval legal systems were built by scholars trained in church law, which, surprise, was written in Latin. The use of Latin added gravitas, mystery, and just enough confusion to ensure only the educated elite could navigate the system. Today we claim it's about precision, but half the time it's just about sounding smarter than the jury. And there's more. Courtrooms still stand on hierarchy, just like medieval courts of law. The judge sits elevated, just like a king on a throne. You rise when they enter, you speak only when spoken to, you wear the right clothes or risk being thrown out. If that's not medieval pageantry with a side of gavel, what is? Scholars debate whether all this pomp is helpful. Some argue that the ritual and formality elevate the process, giving weight to decisions and encouraging respect for the law. Others say it's a dusty distraction, an unnecessary barrier that turns justice into a club for insiders. After all, if your lawyer needs to rent a costume to be taken seriously, maybe the system isn't as modern as it thinks it is. But we can't ignore the psychological angle. The ritual works. Walk into a courtroom and you feel it. The hush, the seriousness, the collective awareness that something important is happening. That's not just the stakes, it's the setting. The robes, the raised bench, the echoing floors. It tells you, this is a place where decisions matter. It's the same reason churches use stained glass and organs. The environment sets the tone. And sure, we've made some changes. In many places, wigs are optional or gone entirely. Some courts allow business attire instead of robes. Zoom trials have forced a weird kind of casualization. Blazers on top, sweatpants below. But the core structure remains unchanged. Court is still a stage, and you're expected to play your part. So the next time you find yourself in a courtroom, whether as a juror, a witness, or just a curious spectator, take a moment to notice the details. The robe, the Latin, the elevated throne chair. You're not just watching modern justice unfold. You're attending a medieval drama that never closed. The script has changed. The stakes might be higher, but the costumes? They're still very much in fashion. And if you ever find yourself tempted to laugh at a powdered wig in 2025, just remember, it's not about looking good. It's about looking ancient. And in the legal world, age is authority, even if it smells like mothballs and moral superiority. So far, we've walked through medieval leftovers in your timekeeping, your hair, your job, and your legal system. But now we're entering sacred territory. The kind of topic people tiptoe around in polite conversation. Purity. Specifically, the centuries-old obsession with virginity. And not just in religious texts or retro horror movies, but in how we talk about bodies, shame, relationships, and yes, even in how we educate people. If you've ever sat through a sex ed class where abstinence was presented like a moral high score, or heard someone described as pure because they've never been with someone, you're not just listening to modern prudishness, you're hearing a medieval echo, loud and holy. Let's rewind to where this fixation really took off, the Christianized medieval West, where the body wasn't just a body, it was a battlefield. The Church, following a blend of Roman Stoicism and biblical literalism, developed a deep suspicion of physical pleasure. Sex, even in marriage, was something to be tolerated at best. Pleasure, that was dangerous. The only truly pure people were the virgins, especially women, because they hadn't been touched by sin. Literally. That's where this starts. Virginity wasn't just a personal status, it was public, sacred, and heavily policed. For women, it became their moral currency. A virgin was closer to God, more valuable in marriage, and, ironically, more powerful in religious iconography. The Virgin Mary wasn't just a holy figure, she was the ideal. She birthed a child without sex, proving once and for all that the best kind of woman was one who could reproduce without ever being, a woman. Monasteries ran with this ideal. Virginity vows were taken by nuns and monks alike, but the female virgin carried special cultural weight. Virgin martyrs became saints. Stories circulated of women who miraculously preserved their virginity through divine protection, or by cutting their hair and disguising themselves as monks to avoid marriage. Entire lives were structured around the preservation of sexual purity, which was often defined not by personal choice, but by a very rigid set of anatomical and behavioural expectations. And of course it wasn't just spiritual, it was economic. Marrying a virgin came with the assurance, however imaginary, that a woman hadn't been used. Gross, absolutely. But in a society obsessed with inheritance, bloodlines and legitimacy, knowing your heir was actually yours mattered. Women were evaluated like property. The fewer previous owners, the higher the value. This turned virginity into a transactional asset, something to guard, display and hand over like a warranty card. Now here's a quirky little detail. Medieval doctors and philosophers believed virginity had a physical seal, the hymen, proof that a woman was untouched. If that wasn't intact on her wedding night, cue the panic. Blood-stained bedsheets were expected. In some cultures they were shown publicly as proof of the bride's worth. No blood? Accusations, annulments, even violence. All over a biological feature that is, by the way, notoriously unreliable as a purity test. And just to crank the pressure up another notch, some medieval folks believed that a woman's moral purity could physically alter her body. A virgin was assumed to be pale, delicate, and soft-spoken. A woman who'd had sex, more robust, more earthy, somehow corrupted. Her body told the truth whether she wanted it to or not. The body was seen not just as a vessel, but as a scoreboard. This culture didn't die with the Renaissance, it just evolved. Fast forward a few centuries, and you've got Victorian purity culture doubling down on the medieval model. Women were still expected to arrive at marriage pure. Men, not so much. Double standards were baked into law, literature and daily life. And while the vocabulary changed, chaste, virtuous, modest, the expectation remained. Virginity wasn't about health or personal choice, it was about control. Which brings us to modern times. If you've heard terms like purity rings, waiting until marriage, or being clean, you're seeing the medieval inheritance at work. Abstinence-only education, prevalent in parts of the US and other countries, isn't rooted in science. It's rooted in centuries of theological baggage. The hymen is still treated like a sacred object. Girls are still taught that their value is tied to what they haven't done. Boys often get a wink and a be careful champ. And sure, people are pushing back now, more open conversations about consent, sexual agency, and the fact that virginity isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. But the shadow of the Middle Ages still lingers. You see it in court cases where a victim's sexual history is used against them, in TV tropes where the good girl is virginal and the bad girl gets punished, in the weird obsession with body counts, like someone's dating history is a moral credit score. Scholars argue over where exactly the obsession started. Was it Greco-Roman Stoicism, early Christian doctrine, patriarchal economic control disguised as theology? The answer, frustratingly, is all of the above. Virginity became a Swiss Army knife of control, religiously sanctioned, medically speculated, socially reinforced. And once that logic got rooted in law, art, and family dynamics, it became very hard to pull out. And let's not forget, this obsession rarely worked both ways. Male virginity was treated with a mix of curiosity and condescension. In some monastic texts, male purity was praised, but outside religious circles, a man who hadn't had sex was more likely to be mocked than revered. The message was clear. Women were expected to be pure. Men, they just had to pretend to care. So the next time you hear someone talk about virginity like it's a meaningful measure of character, pause. Remember that you're listening to a medieval morality tale that's somehow still running on a loop. Virginity isn't a virtue. It's not a test. It's not proof of anything except what someone hasn't done. And if that's the only thing people care about, maybe the real problem isn't what's been lost, but what we're still clinging to. Word count 1089. So far we've wandered through the twisted medieval roots of time, virtue, jobs, wigs and vibes. But let's get into something that hits a little closer to home, like your paycheck. Or, more accurately, how it disappears before you even have a chance to touch it. Taxes, right? Everyone hates them, no one understands them, and somewhere deep in your soul, you suspect that they're part of some ancient scam. And you're not entirely wrong, because before taxes were taxes, they were tithes. The holy, unavoidable, eternally confusing medieval cash grab disguised as spiritual obligation. And surprise, you're still stuck in that logic centuries later. Let's start at the top. The word tithe comes from Old English and means a tenth, as in, you owed 1/10 of everything you produced, crops, livestock, income, whatever, to the church. Not as a donation, not as a suggestion, as a requirement. Imagine if every time you baked a loaf of bread, someone knocked on your door and demanded a slice for Jesus. That was life in medieval Christendom. This wasn't just spiritual, it was legal. Tithes were enforced by law in much of Europe, especially in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. If you didn't pay up, you could be fined, excommunicated, or have your property seized. Picture a bunch of robed men with ledgers and moral superiority rolling up to your farm, demanding chickens in the name of salvation. It was divine extortion with a polite smile. But here's where it gets even weirder. The church wasn't always the direct collector. In many regions, lay people, nobles, or local landlords were granted the right to collect tithes on behalf of the church. This created a glorious system of middlemen who skimmed their own processing fees off the top. And in some cases these rights were passed down like inheritance, which means some random knight's great-grandson might still be collecting grain from peasants in the 1300s because of a deal his ancestor made with a bishop in a tavern. And it didn't stop at money. Tithes came in many forms. Predial tithes, from crops, mixed tithes, from animals, and personal tithes, from trade or wages. Everything from eggs to wool to fish was subject to holy taxation. You might have been fishing for your family's dinner, but if you didn't fork over a portion to the church, that catch might be cursed, or, more likely, confiscated. Now here's the quirky fringe detail. Some towns had tithe barns, massive storage buildings where locals would bring their grain, hay or livestock as part of their contribution. These barns weren't just practical, they were status symbols. If your village had one, it meant you were in the grip of a well-organised tithe network. And yes, they were sometimes guarded. Because shocker, not everyone wanted to part with their best goat every year in the name of salvation. Of course, medieval folks weren't thrilled about this system. Complaints about unfair tithes were everywhere. Some priests demanded more than 10%. Others enforced tithes on crops that technically weren't supposed to count. Lawsuits flared up constantly. Peasants protested. Entire rebellions simmered under the pressure of religious taxation. And still, the church stood firm, reminding everyone that refusing to tithe wasn't just theft, it was sin. Fast forward a few centuries and here's the twist. The idea of tithing eventually bled into secular taxation. As monarchs grew more powerful, they looked at the church's system and thought, hey, we want a cut too. So they developed their own taxes, often modelled on tithes, flat rates, predictable amounts, collected regularly. And since both church and crown needed funding, guess who got squeezed from both ends? And this double duty system didn't exactly disappear. When modern governments developed income taxes, property taxes, and all the other delightful deductions you see draining your bank account, They kept the same logic. The state is owed a slice of whatever you earn. The justification changed, from God demands it to you enjoy public roads, don't you? But the effect stayed the same. You work, they take. Scholars still debate how much medieval tithing directly influenced modern tax structures. Some argue that secular rulers would have developed taxes anyway. Others point out that the church's system provided a ready-made framework for economic control, moral justification, and bureaucratic muscle. And when governments took over, they just swapped out the cross for a crest and kept collecting. And let's not ignore the language. Even today, tax rhetoric sounds like a blend of guilt, obligation, and divine necessity. You owe taxes, you contribute, you give back. These aren't just civic duties, they're spiritual echoes. The IRS may not threaten you with excommunication, but they'll still take your house, and honestly, that feels worse. Then there's the modern equivalent of tithe collectors, payroll departments, digital deduction systems, income tax returns. You don't get to choose when or how much to pay. It's automatic. Just like the old tithe laws that came due whether your crops grew or not. And when April rolls around and you're hunched over TurboTax wondering where your money went, just know you're reenacting a ritual that goes back 1,000 years, except with more math and fewer goats. And yes, in many places, religious tithing still exists too. Churches request 10% of your income. Some even use digital payment portals now. Click here to give your tithe. A very medieval sentiment in a very modern shell. It's not mandatory anymore, not legally anyway, but the moral language hasn't changed. You're told it's your duty. That blessings are tied to generosity. That not giving is, in a sense, cheating God. Sound familiar? So the next time your paycheck arrives already looking thinner than it should, and you see that long list of deductions, income tax, social security, maybe a little health premium, and you mutter, "Where is all my money going?" Just remember, you're paying your tithe. Not to the church, maybe, but to a system that learned long ago how to turn moral obligation into economic policy. And if the ghost of a medieval bishop shows up at your door with a grain sack and a quill, don't worry. He's just here to make sure you didn't forget the chicken you owe. Let's talk about something you've probably never questioned. Your last name. You know, that bit of identity that trails after your first name like an obedient shadow, the part you rattle off on forms, shout over the phone to customer service reps, and occasionally mutter when someone butchers the pronunciation. It seems simple enough. But what if I told you that your surname, yes, yours, was basically medieval GPS, and that this whole naming system we still cling to was designed not for individuality, but for surveillance, sorting, and a whole lot of judgment? To really understand surnames, you have to go back to a time when people didn't have them at all. In early medieval Europe, folks were generally known by a single name: Emma, John, Agnes, Hugh. That worked fine in tiny villages where everyone knew everyone else and you could just point and say, "You mean Hugh the Thatcher or Hugh with the weird eye?" But as towns got bigger, record-keeping became a thing, and governments realised they needed to know who to tax, who to conscript, and who owed what to whom. Well, suddenly John wasn't cutting it anymore. Enter surnames. These didn't start as family heirlooms. They were practical labels slapped onto you to tell you apart from all the other Johns, Marys and Wills clogging up the kingdom, and they almost always fit into one of 4 medieval categories: occupation, location, description, or lineage. Let's break that down. If your ancestor was a smith, a baker, or a cooper, congratulations. You're named after their job. These were the LinkedIn titles of the 12th century. Smiths worked with metal, bakers made bread, and coopers made barrels. And yes, everyone knew. You weren't just Thomas. You were Thomas the blacksmith, which became Thomas Smith, which eventually got passed down to great-great-great-grandkids who've never so much as hammered a nail. Then there are location-based surnames. Think Hill, Wood, Atwater, or even more specific ones like York or London. These indicated where you or your family came from. John of the Hill became John Hill. If your name ends in Tun or Ham, it probably traces back to some medieval hamlet your ancestors fled centuries ago, probably to avoid sheep tax or a neighbour with a grudge. Next, we have surnames based on personal description. These are the most accidentally hilarious: short, long, strong, white, black, brown, and yes, even bald. These names were basically early branding, except you didn't get to choose your brand. If your hair was white early or you had a dramatic mustache, guess what? That became your legacy. And then there's the patronymics. These surnames told everyone whose kid you were. In English, you get names like Johnson, John's son, Williamson, or Harrison. In other cultures, it's even more obvious. The Mac in Scottish names means son of, as in MacDonald, son of Donald. The O in Irish names does the same. In Scandinavia, they took it even further. Anderson, Henriksen, Eriksson, literally changing surnames every generation based on who your dad was. Which sounds chaotic until you realise it was a built-in family tree. And here's where it gets a little dark. The reason all this naming suddenly got very organised in the medieval period? Bureaucracy. As kingdoms solidified and tax systems got more sophisticated, rulers needed to keep track of people, not just the nobles but the commoners too. Surnames were essentially filing labels. Who lives here? Who owes what? Who married who? Who should be conscripted for the next crusade? Your name was your identity, but it was also your report card. One especially quirky case. In 13th century England, a man might go from being Robert the Miller to just Robert Miller, but his son could inherit that name without inheriting the job. So suddenly you've got a family line of millers who are now shepherds, carpenters, or criminally lazy teenagers. But the name stuck. Why? Because the church and the crown had already written it down. And what's written down gets real fast. Some scholars argue that surnames were also about control. Once names became fixed, so did identities. You couldn't just reinvent yourself. You were John Smith, son of John Smith, from the Smith family, of the Smith lineage. If your name suggested low birth, that was it. Good luck social climbing when your surname literally screams "my family makes barrels." But here's the fun twist. This surveillance tool accidentally gave rise to heritage. What started as a way to track tax payments and draft eligibility turned into something people took pride in. By the early modern period, family names were tied to honour, legacy, even aristocracy. The Smiths weren't just workers, they became a clan. Your surname became a flag, not just a file tag. And now, people pay websites to trace them back through their Smith ancestors all the way to some dusty village in Kent. Today, of course, surnames still serve as markers, but the logic hasn't changed much. Governments still use them to track you. IDs, bank accounts, employment records. Your surname is your breadcrumb trail through the modern data forest. And while we're less likely to assume your job based on your last name, we still form snap judgments. Think about how a name like Goldman or Kingsley lands differently than Butcher or Fry. Bias is still baked in. And the kicker, we still pass surnames down like medieval peasants. In many countries, the father's name defaults as the family name. Even when couples hyphenate or merge names, it's treated as a novelty, not the norm. Some cultures preserve the mother's surname as a middle name, but rarely does it take the front seat. It's the same medieval logic. Names follow the bloodline of power. So the next time you fill out a form and mindlessly type your last name, pause. That seemingly boring word is a medieval relic. It might tell you where your people lived, what they did, what they looked like, or who their dad was. It was never meant to be poetic. It was just paperwork. And now, it's your legacy. All right, you've made it this far, through the wigs, the witch tests, the weird obsession with your last name, but now it's time for a little plot twist. What if I told you that some medieval inventions weren't just strange leftovers that survived by accident, but were actually better than what we have now? Yes, you heard that right. For all the dirt, disease, and deeply questionable hygiene choices, the Middle Ages weren't just a long, sweaty prequel to the Enlightenment. In fact, in certain ways, they were weirdly ahead of their time. So tonight, let's pull the curtain back on the myth of progress and meet the monks, masons, and medieval engineers who, frankly, deserve more credit than they get. Let's begin with cities. You probably imagine medieval towns as chaotic hellscapes, muddy streets, open sewers, pigs running loose like it's a reality show for livestock. And yes, some of that is true. But here's the surprise. Many medieval cities had infrastructure that would make your local town council weep. Take the city of Bruges in the 12th century. It had covered drainage canals, designated market zones, and building codes. That's right, actual regulations. London had organised wards. Paris had street cleaning crews. Sure, they used straw and elbow grease instead of power washers, but the point stands, they were managing urban life with medieval tools and doing it surprisingly well. Want something even more advanced? Let's talk about cathedral construction. Those towering Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, weren't just pretty. They were engineering masterpieces. Medieval masons used advanced knowledge of geometry, physics and materials, much of which they didn't even write down. They carved complex stone vaults, perfected the flying buttress, and raised structures hundreds of feet high without cranes or computers. Some of these buildings are still standing, while your local strip mall is probably halfway to collapsing after 2 decades. Here's a quirky medieval flex for you: heating. You think radiant floor heating is a modern luxury? Not so fast. Roman hypercourse systems were revived in parts of the medieval world, especially in bathhouses and monasteries. Some even used hollow wall bricks to circulate warm air. Not every peasant hut was cosy, of course, but high-status buildings had innovations we don't give them credit for. Medieval castles had built-in ventilation shafts to reduce smoke inhalation. Some even had early versions of double glazing. Meanwhile, you're probably freezing in an overpriced apartment with a single-pane window and a radiator from 1953. Medicine? Okay, yes. Leeching was a thing. And yes, some treatments were more herbs and prayers than actual science. But don't write off the whole era. Medieval Islamic and Jewish physicians in the Middle East and Spain were producing detailed medical texts, performing surgeries, and advocating for things like diet and hygiene. Hospitals existed, not just as places to die slowly, but as organised care centres, many of them run by religious orders. The word hospital comes from hospitality, and medieval versions often included care for the poor, travellers, and even orphans. A lot more community-minded than some modern health systems, if we're being honest. Still not convinced? Let's talk education. We love to mock the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance, but universities like Oxford, Bologna and Paris were already producing scholars in the 12th century. The trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric and quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, formed the basis of a liberal arts education. People weren't just copying texts, they were debating philosophy, running experiments, writing treatises. Thomas Aquinas was nerding out over Aristotle while half the continent was still figuring out how to boil water. And how about travel? Despite popular belief, people did move around in the Middle Ages. Pilgrimages were a thing. So were trade routes, merchant guilds, and cultural exchange. The Silk Road was active. Maritime maps got more sophisticated. Even the postal system wasn't a total disaster. Monasteries, noble estates, and merchant networks all maintained communication channels. Sure, it took weeks, but it got there. Unlike that package you ordered 3 weeks ago that's currently in transit between nowhere and limbo. Even environmental design had its moments. Medieval farmers used crop rotation systems that preserved soil health, a practice that later industrial agriculture completely bulldozed in the name of efficiency. Forest laws, though oppressive, were an early form of natural resource management. Some towns had communal grazing rights and limits on how many animals could be kept in certain areas to avoid overgrazing. They didn't call it sustainability, but they were thinking about balance long before climate change became a PowerPoint slide. Now let's not go full Renaissance fair and pretend everything was perfect. There were famines, plagues, rigid hierarchies, and a heavy reliance on superstition. Open wounds were treated with mercury, rats were basically roommates. But the narrative that the Middle Ages were a complete intellectual and technological void, that's just historical laziness, or worse, snobbery. Scholars have long debated the term Dark Ages, and most agree it's wildly misleading. It was coined during the Renaissance by people who wanted to make themselves look good. We're the smart ones, they said, and everyone before us was dumb. Sound familiar? It's the same logic tech bros use today. Dismiss everything old as obsolete so you can sell your shiny new solution. Never mind that some of those medieval solutions still work better. Take bread. Medieval bakers knew how to ferment dough with natural yeast, creating sourdoughs and dense, nutritious loaves. Then came industrialized white bread, packed with air and stripped of nutrients. Congratulations! Progress made your sandwich worse, or take light. Stained glass windows didn't just look cool, they were designed to filter sunlight in a way that created a sense of divine presence. Meanwhile, your office building blasts you with flickering LEDs and zero architectural soul. But hey, at least it's energy efficient. So next time someone sneers at the Middle Ages, ask them how their smart home is doing. Still crashing? Lights flickering? Can't flush the toilet without Wi-Fi? Meanwhile, there's a cathedral in France that's been standing for 800 years and still doesn't leak when it rains. The truth is, progress is not always linear. It zigs, it zags. Sometimes it forgets things and has to relearn them. And sometimes, the things we mock from the past are the exact things we should be bringing back. Just maybe skip the plague masks. Okay, so you've survived plague cures, peasant taxes, divine time management, and the occasional flying buttress. But before we turn out the lights and let you drift into that well-earned sleep, there's one last medieval artifact we need to talk about. Not a relic or a custom, but something far grander. Something we still romanticize, sketch in our notebooks, turn into theme parks, and binge-watch across entire streaming platforms. Yep, we're talking about castles, specifically our completely irrational obsession with them. Because whether you're aware of it or not, you're still low-key enchanted by castles. And that is weird. Let's start with the basic fact. Castles were never meant to be cute. They weren't cozy dream homes for princesses. They were cold, drafty fortresses designed to survive sieges and Project Dominance. Picture a grey slab of stone sticking out of a muddy hill surrounded by peasants who can't afford shoes. The inside, narrow staircases, terrible lighting, and the constant smell of burning tallow candles mixed with mildew. Yet somehow, modern life treats castles like the real estate equivalent of a mood board. Want proof? Look at luxury homes designed to feel like a castle. You'll see fake turrets, dramatic archways, wrought iron chandeliers, and stone fireplaces that never get used. We design hotel lobbies with medieval flair. We plan destination weddings in historic manor houses. We play video games where the goal is to storm or build a castle. And don't even get me started on theme parks, where an entire generation grew up believing castles were magical rainbow-launching dream factories. Cinderella had us all fooled. But why? Why the obsession with medieval strongholds built by lords who probably bathed once a month and kept falcons indoors? Some scholars point to nostalgia. Castles represent a mythic time when things felt simple. Kings ruled, knights protected. People knew their place. Never mind that their place was usually the dirt outside the walls, hoping the guy with the sword didn't tax their chickens again. In our collective imagination, castles are the opposite of modern chaos. They're stable, solid, eternal. The irony is, castles were often anything but stable. They changed hands constantly. One siege and the banners flipped. Lords betrayed kings. Cousins fought over towers. Castles burned, crumbled, and got rebuilt with newer, more paranoid designs. Murder holes were a real feature. Slits in the ceiling where defenders could dump boiling oil or rocks onto anyone trying to force the gate. Not exactly family-friendly, and yet we keep coming back. Even in architecture, the medieval aesthetic refuses to die. Look at any old university campus. Gothic arches, flying buttresses, ivy-covered stone. Why? Because it says tradition. It looks wise, solemn, important. It doesn't matter if the building was constructed in 1924. If it looks like a 13th century chapel, it must be legitimate. That's medieval prestige, still casting its shadow. Here's a quirky fact for you. The whole castler's cosy dream didn't even exist until much later. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Gothic revival, wealthy people in Britain started building fake castles, not for defence, but for vibes. They installed turrets and battlements on otherwise normal mansions. These were the original cosplay homes, and people loved it. Suddenly, castles weren't symbols of tyranny, they were aesthetic, romantic, quaint. From there it spiraled. Fairy tales got repackaged with castles in the clouds. Writers like Walter Scott glamorized medieval ruins. Then came movies, cartoons, and the full Disneyification of castle life. You didn't want a mortgage, you wanted a moat. Never mind that your plumbing would freeze in the walls and your great hall would cost $900 a month to heat. Of course, castles also sneak into your head in more subtle ways. That fantasy of building your dream house, often full of medieval tropes, stone walls, arched windows, fireplaces taller than your cousin. The entire open-plan kitchen/living room layout, borrowed from the Great Hall concept, where everything happened in one big room, usually because there weren't enough chimneys to go around. Your farmhouse aesthetic with exposed beams. Medieval peasants had those too, just not because they wanted rustic charm. It was literally all they could afford. Now, let's not pretend castles are all bad. They were engineering marvels for their time, and they do look amazing on postcards. Some even became centres of learning, culture and local government, but they were also symbols of extreme hierarchy. The lord lived above, literally. The higher your room, the higher your rank. Servants slept in the cold near the kitchens or stables. Peasants stayed outside the walls. Castles enforced social distance before that was a pandemic thing. And yet, the dream persists. Because deep down, castles feed that old medieval part of your brain that wants structure, legacy, and a really dramatic front door. We want something to last. Something made of stone in a world of drywall and LED strip lights. And honestly, fair enough. The world feels chaotic, and castles look like the one building that might not get swallowed up by time. Scholars debate why this longing runs so deep. Some say it's cultural DNA, passed down from centuries of living under lords and monarchs. Others say it's escapism, pure and simple. After all, modern life has fluorescent lighting and rent. Castles have fireplaces and destiny. No contest. So go ahead, love your castles, visit them, read stories about them, build a little Lego one if that's your thing. Just remember that the original castles weren't made to be admired. They were built to keep you out. And yet here we are, still peering in through the portcullis like wide-eyed dreamers, romanticising the stone cages our ancestors worked so hard to escape. Funny how that works. So here we are, 30 sections later, one long torch-lit trek through the halls of medieval logic that still echo in your everyday life. Who would have thought your 9 to 5, your hair, your taxes, your awkward dinner manners, and even your last name all come with receipts from the Middle Ages? But that's the thing about history. It doesn't just sit in books or castles or creepy old paintings. It lives in your routines. It breathes through your habits. It sneaks into your closet, your job description, your social etiquette, and occasionally your bathroom tiles. And yeah, a lot of those rules, they don't make much sense anymore. They're like haunted software, still running in the background, slowing things down, crashing your brain every now and then with a guilt trip or a weird expectation. The worst part, most of us never asked for any of this. We're just carrying around medieval code disguised as modern life, confusing how it's always been with how it has to be. But here's the part you get to take with you. Knowing is power. When you realise that your unpaid internship is a recycled feudal apprenticeship, or that your boss's obsession with time tracking is a monk's bell tower in disguise, or that your last name was basically a medieval tracking device, you can choose how much of it to keep. You can laugh at it, question it, ignore it, change it. That's the real progress, not just updating the tech, but finally interrogating the rulebook we never agreed to follow. Because let's face it, most of us are still trying to find our way out of the castle, still trying to climb out of the mud with a little more dignity than our ancestors were allowed, still trying to live by rules that actually serve us, instead of ones that serve the ghosts of long-dead lords, popes and kings. So tonight, as the digital bells fall silent and the last flicker of candlelight dims, give yourself a little credit. You've survived medieval time without losing your mind. You've sat through the entire script, maybe in bed, maybe under a blanket, maybe staring into the void wondering why forks have rules. You made it. Now take a deep breath, shake off the feudal residue. The castle gates are open. You're free to leave.